Tonight we bring you 20 true creepy stories from abandoned farmhouses scattered through Texas. Across the wide, restless plains and dusty back roads of Texas lie farmhouses long left to rot. In the silence, you'll hear creaks in the dark, whispers between broken windows, and cold reminders that some houses never forget the people who disappeared inside them. But before we step through those thresholds of shadow, here's a warning. Most viewers make one fatal mistake. They hear the stories and forget to subscribe. By leaving too early, they miss the creepiest legends, the ones that chase you long after the screen goes dark. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now, because tonight is just the beginning, and the terror buried across these farms is far from done. So tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments, because here in Texas, darkness comes early and it never truly ends. Now, let's step into the shuddering shadows of those farmhouse walls. I was driving through Bowie County when the sky began to change color. Out there, the clouds don't just roll in, they crawl, low and slow, like they're sniffing the ground for what they want to take. I had been on the road since dawn, following a map I'd found in an antique store, the kind drawn by hand with more memory than accuracy. It showed the faint trace of a property line and one word scribbled near it: Reed. I didn't know why that name pulled me the way it did. Maybe because my grandmother used to mention a family out near the border who lost their daughter one harvest night, back before the interstate cut through the farms. The story had lived somewhere in my mind ever since, and I thought maybe if I saw the place, I'd understand what made her voice shake when she told it. The turnoff was nothing but a dirt cut through dying grass. It looked like it hadn't been driven in 20 years, but the ruts were still there, pressed deep into the soil like veins under pale skin. The road ran between the husks of cornstalks. Most had gone gray, some bent at the neck like they were bowing. The air smelled like dust and wet iron, a promise of rain that hadn't come yet. When I finally saw the farmhouse, it rose out of the corn like something that had been waiting under the surface and decided to stand up again. The house was 2 stories, the kind they built when people thought things would last forever. The porch sagged and the windows were covered from the inside with yellowing newspaper. A metal windmill leaned against the sky, its blades missing or bent, but when the wind shifted, one still turned. It made a slow scraping noise, the sound of metal remembering what it used to be. I parked the truck and cut the engine. The silence after the motor died was heavier than I expected, thick enough that I could hear the blood in my ears. People say the last Reed daughter went into the cornfield one night in 1954 and never came back. Her name was Clara, and her mother heard her scream once, then nothing. The sheriff searched, the neighbors helped, and they plowed up half the crop looking for her, but all they ever found was one shoe. The Reeds moved away a year later and the land never sold again. Some folks said the house was cursed, others said the girl had simply run off. My grandmother never said which she believed. She just told me the wind out there had a voice of its own. I stepped onto the porch and the first board I touched let out a moan that felt too human. The air was cooler near the door, like the shade carried its own temperature. I tried the handle. It turned easy, almost like the house had been waiting for me. Inside, everything was colorless. The wallpaper had curled off the walls in long strips, and where it had peeled back, black mold bloomed like spilled ink. A single chair sat in the middle of the room facing a fireplace filled with ashes. The hearth had a family name carved into it: Reed, the E's uneven like a child's work. Dust floated in the air and made halos around the light coming through the cracks in the walls. I walked to the back door and saw that the field ran right up to the fence line, the stalks still standing despite decades without care. They moved gently even though the air felt still. I was about to turn back when I heard it. A woman's voice, thin and broken, carried just enough to freeze me. It wasn't a scream exactly, more like the sound someone makes when they're trying not to cry. It came from the field. My body knew before my mind did that I was going out there. The gate hung by one hinge. I slipped through, boots sinking into the soil. The rows swallowed me. The corn wasn't high anymore, but dense enough to close around me fast. The sound came again, closer this time. My pulse was loud in my throat. Every few steps I caught a whiff of something sharp, earth mixed with something sweet like decayed fruit. The air shifted and the stalks rustled behind me, though I hadn't moved. There was a clearing maybe 30 feet in, just a small circle of bare dirt where the corn refused to grow. In the middle sat a scarecrow. Its hat had rotted away, leaving only a black skull of burlap and wire. The arms stretched out stiffly, but the strange thing was its clothes. They looked too new. A red gingham dress, faded but clean, tied with a strip of white ribbon around the waist. It was the kind of dress a girl might have worn to a church picnic 60 years ago. The fabric fluttered a little, though the air was dead still. I walked closer because curiosity always outruns fear. There was stitching around the scarecrow's neck where the burlap met the collar. The stitches weren't straight. Whoever had sewn them had used different thread colors, red, black, blue, whatever they could find. When I reached out, a gust came up from nowhere and the dress snapped tight against the figure, and I saw, just for a moment, that the shape beneath the fabric wasn't straw. The chest rose once, sharply, like something caught between breathing and not. I stumbled back, tripping into the dirt. The wind kept blowing even though the clouds above hadn't moved. The stalks bent in toward the clearing, whispering against each other like paper. And then the sound came again, that same quiet cry, but now it was right behind me. I turned and saw nothing, only the movement of the corn. The scarecrow's head turned, slow and deliberate, following me. The sound that came from its burlap mouth was like air being pulled through wet cloth. I ran. I couldn't even tell which way I was going, just away from that clearing. The rows didn't make sense anymore. They twisted back into each other like the field was folding itself around me. I could still hear her, closer every time the wind changed. I broke through into the yard and didn't stop until I hit the porch steps. My hands shook so bad I dropped my keys twice trying to get in the truck. When the engine finally turned, I saw something in the rearview mirror, just a shape standing at the edge of the corn. Small, still. The red dress catching light like a flag. I drove until the field was gone and the road turned to blacktop. The storm broke behind me, the sound like 1,000 whispers finally finding their voice. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. I told myself I'd imagined it, that my mind had stitched an old ghost story into the real world because I wanted it to mean something. But that night, when I checked my jacket pocket for my lighter, I found something else. A ribbon, white but stained with a line of brown down one edge. It smelled faintly of corn and smoke. I didn't sleep much after that. Every night the wind outside my apartment window had a pitch to it that wasn't natural. Sometimes it sounded like a voice carried far off, a woman calling for someone she couldn't see. The first time I heard it, I turned on every light in the place. By the third night, I just lay there and listened. Somewhere between the gusts, I thought I heard my name, soft but sure, like someone who'd been waiting a long time to be answered. A week later, I went back. I don't even know why. Maybe because fear turns to guilt if you sit with it long enough. The road was worse than before, washed out in places. When I reached the fence, the corn was gone. Every stalk had been cut to the ground. The field was bare. The farmhouse leaned a little more, but it looked almost peaceful now, like it had finally exhaled. I stepped out and crossed the yard. Near where the scarecrow had been, there was a single cross made of 2 broken boards tied with that same white ribbon. At the base of it lay a shoe, small and half buried in the dirt. The leather was cracked, but you could still see the outline of a flower pressed into the side. The wind came through again, gentle this time. It didn't sound like crying anymore. It sounded like someone humming a tune too old to remember the words to. I stood there until the light started to fade and the sky took on that bruised color again. When I finally walked away, the air behind me stayed calm. No footsteps, no whispers, just the hush of land that had finally been heard. But as I reached the truck, I heard one last thing. The faint clink of metal against wood, like something swaying on a post. I turned once more, and for just a second I saw the ribbon lift on its own, caught by a breeze that didn't touch anything else around it. Then it fell still. On the drive back through the county line, the wind shifted in through the open window. It carried the smell of dirt and old corn. Under the hum of the tires, I swore I could hear a girl's voice, faint but sure, singing to herself. It wasn't a cry anymore. It sounded like relief. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw the passenger seat wasn't empty. There was a shadow sitting there, small and still, watching the fields roll by as if she finally knew the way home. The Hollow Creek homestead sat deep in the scrubland of Llano County, a patch of rolling cedar hills and granite outcrops where the nights were darker than ink, and the air after a storm carried the scent of wet limestone. I first saw it in late March, right after one of those spring thunderstorms that make the whole sky bruise purple and green before the lightning tears it open. The old farmhouse had been abandoned for nearly 40 years, according to the county records. I bought it anyway. I told myself it was for the land, for the quiet. But there was something about that house that kept drawing my eyes back to its photo in the listing. Something in the way the windows reflected the gray clouds like wet eyes. It wasn't much to look at up close. A sagging 2-story frame house, paint peeled down to the bare wood, porch collapsing on one side, a tin roof that glinted dull silver under the sun. The realtor didn't want to go inside. She handed me the key and waited by her truck while I crossed the porch. The boards creaked like they were whispering warnings, soft and uneven, and the air smelled faintly of wet plaster and something sweetly rotten. I remember that the first thing I noticed once I stepped in was the silence. The house didn't groan or sigh like most old places. It just sat there, hollow and listening. The floors were warped from years of flooding. Hollow Creek ran behind the property, usually just a trickle, but the storms turned it into a churning brown vein that swelled right up to the edge of the pasture. The house had been built too close to it, probably in the 1880s, and water stains climbed halfway up the walls. There was an attic door at the end of the upstairs hallway, one of those square drop doors with a frayed rope hanging down. The realtor had warned me about the flooding, said rainwater somehow pooled in odd places, that the floors warped differently every year. She didn't mention what the locals whispered about, the thing with the attic and the rain. I didn't hear that until later. The first storm hit 2 nights after I moved in. I'd brought just enough furniture to make it livable, a cot, a table, a couple of lamps. The power flickered constantly, and when the thunder rolled over the hills, it sounded like the earth was cracking in half. Around midnight, the sound of rain against the tin roof turned heavy and relentless. I got up to check for leaks. That's when I saw it, the water on the floor in the hallway. At first, I thought it was just puddling from a ceiling leak, but it wasn't dripping down. It was moving, slow and steady. Like a living thing, the shallow layer of water crept toward the far end of the hall, uphill, right toward the attic door. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, tried to convince myself it was a trick of the floorboards. But the boards weren't sloped. The water was defying gravity, sliding in a single sheet toward the rope that hung from the ceiling. I spent the rest of the night listening to the storm and telling myself I'd imagined it. The next morning, the hallway was dry. I almost convinced myself I'd been half asleep. But that night, when the rain started again, it happened once more. The water gathered near the baseboards, shimmering faintly under the weak light bulb, and inched its way toward the attic door like it had somewhere to be. When I touched it, it was icy cold. Colder than rainwater should have been, almost metallic. I felt a faint vibration under my fingertips like the hum of distant machinery. After a week of rain, I decided to check the attic. I climbed the hallway ladder, pushed open the door, and the smell hit me first. Damp wood, mold, and something else faintly coppery. The attic was empty except for a few broken trunks and the skeletons of old wasp nests clinging to the rafters. The floor was warped but dry. The light from my flashlight caught a patch of dark stain near the center, round and dull like dried blood. I didn't stay long. The place felt wrong, thick with a kind of pressure that made my ears ache. When I came back down, I realized the hallway below was damp again, even though the storm hadn't started. A few days later, a man from Llano stopped by after seeing my truck in the driveway. His name was Eldon, an old rancher from a few miles up the road. He asked if I knew what I'd bought. When I said I didn't believe in stories, he smiled without humor. They called this place the Hollow Creek Homestead for a reason, he said. Used to belong to a family named Cates, had 3 kids. Whole lot of bad luck. Creek flooded one year, took 2 of them. Folks said the daddy tried to save him, but they found him in the attic instead. Drowned with the kids' clothes laid out around him. Thing is, the water never reached the house. Sheriff said it was bone dry that night. I wanted to laugh it off, but I didn't. The next storm came the following weekend. I stayed up to watch. Just before midnight, the same thing happened. Water seeped in from the edges of the floorboards, pooling around my feet, then rising. Not down the hall this time, but right under me, like it was seeking something. The air grew colder. The smell of wet wood gave way to something sour like pond water. The walls groaned once, then went still. And then I heard it. Footsteps above me, slow and heavy, pacing across the attic floor. I ran outside into the rain, but even out there, the sound didn't stop. The creek had overflowed, spilling through the pasture, but the current didn't move right. It wasn't flowing downhill. It was pushing toward the house. I could see it in the lightning flashes. the water rippling the wrong way, climbing the steps, running along the porch boards toward the door. I didn't go back inside that night. When dawn came, the water had receded. The creek ran quiet again, but when I opened the front door, muddy prints led from the porch inside, small and bare like a child's. They went straight down the hall and disappeared beneath the attic door. I moved out 2 days later, left everything behind. When I came back with the realtor to collect my tools, the house was dry, cleaner than before. She noticed something on the floor upstairs, a pattern in the warped wood, faint but visible under the light. Circles carved into the boards, old and shallow, like someone had etched them there long ago. Each circle overlapped the next, all centered beneath the attic hatch. The realtor called it water damage. I didn't correct her. But that night, when the rain started again as we drove out of Llano County, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The roof of the Hollow Creek homestead gleamed under the lightning. For a split second, I saw water trickling down from the attic vent, not out, but in, climbing against the wind, disappearing into the dark mouth of that house. I don't go near that road anymore, but every time a storm rolls across those hills, I remember how the water moved. It didn't flow like something alive. It flowed like something remembering where it used to be. Under the bruised Texas sky, the Blake dairy sat on the outskirts of Ennis like a skeleton of what it used to be. Its white paint had peeled into curling strips. The silo leaned a few degrees too far, and the smell of sour hay and old milk clung to the air like a warning. Locals said it had been abandoned for nearly 20 years, ever since the Blake family vanished one autumn night, leaving supper half-eaten on the table and every cow in the pen dead by morning. But there were stranger stories too. Stories whispered in bars off Highway 287 about how the cows still came back at midnight, lowing softly, following a bell no one could see. I didn't believe in that sort of thing when I first moved to Ennis. I'd just bought a little plot outside of town, close enough to the interstate to hear the trucks humming through the night, far enough from neighbors that no one would care if I made noise fixing up the place. I wasn't looking for ghosts. I was looking for quiet. But on my second week, I started hearing the bell. It was faint, far away, drifting across the pastures like a church service in the fog. I thought maybe someone still had livestock nearby, maybe a stray cow had gotten loose. But when I asked around in town, every rancher just shook their head and said, "That sound? That ain't a cowbell. That's the Blake bell. You don't want to go out there after dark." That sort of thing sticks in your head. You tell yourself you're not superstitious, but you still start glancing toward the fields when the wind carries something faint and metallic. I held out for a week before curiosity got the better of me. I packed a flashlight, grabbed my old .22 rifle, and drove the truck out to the edge of the Blake property just before midnight. The gate was still there, chained and rusted. The sign hung crooked, letters barely legible. Blake Dairy Co. Estier, 1949. The moonlight made the weeds look silver as they moved like slow waves in the night breeze. Somewhere out in that field, I heard the faint jangle of a bell, soft, deliberate, like it was moving in a rhythm. I climbed the fence and started walking toward it. The ground squelched under my boots. The smell of mud and manure was stronger than it should have been for an empty farm. The closer I got, the clearer the sound became. It wasn't random. It was steady. 2 rings, a pause, 2 more. When the flashlight beam hit the pen, I froze. The gate stood open. The fence was still intact, but the space inside was filled with shapes. Dark, solid shapes standing shoulder to shoulder. My light caught the glint of something wet on their hides. It looked like a herd of cattle, maybe 20 of them, all perfectly still. None of them made a sound. Then the bell rang again, this time right beside me. I swung the light around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the space was empty. My breath fogged in the air. The cows began to move. Slow, synchronized, their heads turned toward me one by one as if they'd been waiting for a signal. Their eyes caught the light, reflecting a dull red glow that wasn't from the beam. My chest tightened. I stumbled back a step, nearly tripping over a rut. The bell rang again, louder, like it was inside my head. Then something brushed past me, a cold draft that smelled like old milk and wet straw, and the beam flickered. When it came back on, the pen was empty. The gate was swinging gently, creaking in the wind, and the ground where the cattle had stood was covered in hoof prints that sank deep into the soil. I turned and ran, didn't look back until I reached the truck. The sound of that bell followed me all the way down the road. fading only when I crossed the creek that marked the edge of the property. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the red glint of their eyes, the way they'd turned in perfect unison. By morning, I'd half convinced myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the light, a dream mixed with the smell of mold from the old house. But then I found something on my porch, a cowbell, rusted, pitted, with a thin leather strap attached. It wasn't there the night before. When I picked it up, a faint hum came through the metal, like it was vibrating from deep inside. I drove it to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Evers, a man with 50 years of sun on his skin and a voice like gravel, just looked at it, then at me. "You didn't go out there, did you?" he asked. When I nodded, he sighed. "Should have left it alone. That place was cursed long before it burned." I hadn't heard anything about a fire. He told me the story like it hurt him to remember it. In 1984, the Blake Dairy was thriving. Dozens of cows, family of 5, everything above board. Then one summer night, the herd came back from grazing and refused to enter the barn. They just stood there, mooing and shuffling until the eldest son went out with a lantern. He never came back. They found his boots in the mud the next morning, and the herd was dead. Every cow, eyes open, tongues black. A few weeks later, the barn caught fire. Some say lightning struck it, but there hadn't been a storm that night. The rest of the Blake family vanished, and what was left of the property went up for sale, though no one ever bought it. The sheriff said the bell was the only thing they found untouched in the ashes. I tried to get rid of it. I threw it in the river behind my house. 2 nights later, I heard it again, clanging softly from the barn I'd been fixing up on my land. When I went to look, the bell was hanging from a nail in the rafters. That's when I realized it wasn't just about that dairy. The bell wasn't tied to the land, it was tied to whoever heard it ring. The next few nights blurred together. The cows came back, not just at the Blake place, but in my fields too. Shadows moving in the mist, slow and deliberate. I could see their shapes through the fog, smell the rot of wet hide and the metallic tang of something older. The sound of their hooves echoed like drum beats through the ground. I locked every door, every window, but it didn't matter. The bell rang inside the house. I followed it to the kitchen. It was hanging above the table, swinging slightly. When I reached up to stop it, the air turned cold enough to see my breath. Something heavy brushed past my legs. When I looked down, I saw hoof prints forming in the dust on the floor, circling me, pressing deeper and deeper until I felt the floorboards creak under the weight. Then the smell hit: sour milk, smoke, burned hair. I ran outside and didn't stop until I reached the road. From there, I could see my house lit by a dull orange glow, like a fire starting from within the walls. I never went back. Sometimes when the wind shifts just right, I can still hear the bell from miles away. Always the same pattern. 2 rings, a pause, 2 more. Folks in Ennis still talk about the Blake Dairy, how the cows come back to the empty pen at midnight, but they don't know that the sound travels. They don't know that once you hear it, it keeps following you, mile by mile, night after night. And somewhere out there, in the dark between the pastures and the road, they're still walking. An invisible herd guided by a bell no one can see, coming home to a place that doesn't exist anymore. When the moon turns red over the Sutton Ranch, the air changes first. You can feel it in your skin before you see it in the sky. The wind dies, the coyotes go silent, and every rusted gate on that sprawling property creaks as if the metal itself is trying to remember something. Locals in Gainesville still talk about that ranch like it's a living thing, something that breathes, something that waits. You won't find it on any map, not anymore. The county paved over the road leading there decades ago. But if you drive far enough down Highway 82 and take the wrong turn into the mesquite brush, you'll find the iron fence half buried in vines. The letters still spell Sutton, though most of the paint has peeled off like old skin. The first time I saw the place, I was 17. My uncle had bought cattle from a man named Harold Sutton years before, and after Harold died, his son invited us to pick up some equipment that was left behind. The drive out there took most of the day. The sky was a deep, endless blue, the kind you only see in North Texas before a storm. By the time we reached the property, the sun was sinking behind the hills and the whole ranch looked like it was on fire, all gold and shadow. The farmhouse stood at the center like a skeleton dressed in wood. 2 stories, wide porch, windows boarded from the inside. The barn leaned against itself like a drunk. Everything smelled of dust, motor oil, and something sweetly rotten, like fruit that had died on the vine. We found the shed first. My uncle took the tools we came for, but I kept wandering, drawn by the sound of something tapping against the windmill. It was a chain, loose and swinging. Beneath it, a trough filled with water the color of rust. When I bent down, I saw something etched into the side of the trough. Names, dozens of them. I ran my finger across the letters and they felt fresh. Not carved years ago, but recently. Sharp, clean, deliberate. I didn't recognize any of them until I reached the last one. Sutton. The last name was deeper than the others, almost gouged into the metal. When I told my uncle, he said it was nothing, probably just the old man marking his herd troughs. But when I asked if he'd ever seen names carved like that before, he didn't answer. He just told me to get back to the truck. That night, as we loaded the equipment, the sky went strange. The moon climbed, and it wasn't white anymore. It was red, deep as blood, and bright enough to throw shadows. My uncle muttered something about a lunar eclipse, but it didn't feel like any eclipse I'd ever seen. The whole ranch came alive. The windmill spun, though there was no wind. The boards on the house rattled like something inside was trying to get out. And then the whispering started. Faint at first, almost like grass moving, but clearer the longer you listened. It came from the house. My uncle heard it too. We both froze, standing in the dirt, eyes fixed on that house as the voices grew louder. They weren't speaking words we could understand. Just a low murmur, rising and falling until one voice broke through the others and called my uncle's name. Not shouted, whispered. Soft as a prayer, but coming from every direction. He grabbed my arm and we ran. We didn't stop until the truck's headlights hit the main road. I looked back once and I swear I saw someone standing on the porch, a man in a hat, staring at us. His clothes didn't move in the wind because there wasn't any. The red moon hung right above him, and I could see that he was grinning. We never went back, but I couldn't shake the memory. Years later, when I was in my 30s, I started hearing rumors about the place again. Teenagers breaking in, seeing lights, hearing their names whispered from the fields. One kid claimed he saw his dead mother sitting in a rocking chair by the window. The sheriff dismissed it all as small-town superstition, but one by one the stories piled up. Always the same night. Always when the moon turned red. I went back last year. I don't know why. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt. The fence was gone, the gate half collapsed, but the path was still there, winding through the mesquite. The house hadn't aged a day. The porch sagged in the same spot. The boards were still nailed over the windows, and the same smell, oil, dust, and something sweet, hung in the air. I walked around the back, flashlight in hand, and found the family graveyard. Dozens of small headstones behind a line of oaks, all carved with the same name, Sutton. Some old, some recent. The newest one caught my eye. The dirt was still loose around the base, and the stone read Harold Sutton Jr. died October 14, 2019. The date froze me. That was the same day my uncle had died of a heart attack. I remember because I'd been the one to find him in his barn, sitting upright on a stool, eyes wide open, mouth full of dirt like he'd been trying to eat the ground. As I stared at that grave, I heard the whisper again, soft from the porch, then closer from the trees. My flashlight flickered, and for a second I thought I saw movement in the shadows, figures pale and blurred stepping between the stones. My name came next, drawn out slow and wet like it was being spoken through soil. I turned to run, but the ground gave way beneath me. I landed hard in something shallow and cold. When I shone the light, I saw that I'd fallen into an open grave, and there, carved into the side of the wood box beneath me, was my name, my full name. The letters were raw, freshly cut. I scrambled out and ran until I hit my car. I didn't stop driving until I reached town. My jeans were caked with dirt and what looked like ash. When I got home, I found my reflection in the mirror and saw a smear of red across my neck, thin as a cut. I didn't feel it, but it was there, just below my ear, running all the way to my collarbone. It took days to fade. Every night it burned, and every night I dreamed of that house, the whispers, and the red moon staring down like an open wound. They say the Sutton Ranch still stands, though no one lives there. But when the moon turns red, you can hear the wind pick up from that direction. And if you listen close enough, you'll hear the voices. Not angry, not cruel, just waiting to call another name. Pine Hollow Farm sat 5 miles off the main road, down a lane that had forgotten what pavement felt like. The mailbox was nothing but a rusted tin stump with a name half burned away by weather. The fields on either side were shoulder-high with weeds, hiding the old barbed wire fences that used to keep in cattle but now just marked the boundaries of a graveyard made of memories. Folks in Jasper County didn't talk much about Pine Hollow anymore, but they noticed things. Every dawn, before the sun had even shaken the mist off the pine trees, the air on that road smelled like biscuits and black coffee. Not the kind from a thermos or gas station either. Fresh, hot, homemade. The kind you could almost taste if you breathed deep enough. I didn't believe it until I smelled it myself. I was a reporter back then, working for the East Texas Chronicle, chasing down ghost stories for the Halloween edition. Jasper County had plenty to choose from, but something about that smell kept coming up in conversations. Old men at the diner talked about it between sips of coffee. Truckers swore they caught whiffs of it when they passed the tree line near dawn. I figured it was some lingering scent from a decomposing animal or swamp gas. Anything but what they said. They said someone was still cooking breakfast up there. The first time I saw the farmhouse, the sun was just starting to bleed through the fog. The structure leaned like it had grown tired of standing, its roof sagging under years of rain and neglect. A porch swing still hung from the rafters, squeaking gently even though there was no wind. I parked my truck by the overgrown drive and stepped out. That's when it hit me. The smell. It was soft at first, like the memory of a Sunday morning in your grandmother's kitchen. Warm bread, grease on a skillet, coffee strong enough to bite back. The longer I stood there, the stronger it became until I could almost hear the clatter of pans. I looked toward the house, half expecting to see a curtain move, but the windows were black as coal. Inside it was worse. The air hung heavy, full of dust and the faint echo of something domestic. A table still sat in the middle of the kitchen, coated in grime but set for two. Plates, forks, even a chipped mug with dried coffee stains etched like fingerprints. I don't know why, but I touched the back of one of the chairs. It was warm. Not hot, but the kind of warmth you feel from something recently used. My stomach turned over. There were photos on the counter, their colors melted from time. A man and woman stood out front of the same house, smiling like life was just beginning. The back of the photo had a date written in pencil, April 1954. That was 50 years before the county record said the house was abandoned. The husband was named Earl, the wife Marie. They'd been farmers raising chickens and corn until the drought hit. The locals whispered that when the crops died, something in Earl died too. By 1957, both of them were gone. No kids, no kin. The farm fell silent. I stayed longer than I should have, taking notes, snapping photos, trying to rationalize everything. But the longer I lingered, the more it felt like the house was watching me. Every creak in the floorboard seemed timed to my heartbeat. When I stepped into the parlor, I saw a kettle sitting on the stove. It was black with rust, but the faintest trail of steam rose from its spout. I told myself it was condensation, a trick of the cold air. Still, I turned and left, but I didn't make it to the door. The screen door slammed shut in front of me. Not a breeze, not gravity. It slammed like someone had kicked it. The noise echoed through the house, and from somewhere deep inside came the faint sound of a woman humming. It wasn't cheerful. It was slow, drawn out like the sound of someone remembering a tune they used to love but can't quite finish. I froze, trying to listen. The smell of coffee grew stronger. I swear I heard a chair slide across the kitchen floor behind me. I ran. Out the door, through the overgrown yard, down the dirt drive until my lungs burned. When I reached the truck, I turned back once. The front door of the farmhouse was open, and I could see the faint glow of a light swinging in the kitchen. Back in town, I asked the sheriff if he'd ever gone up there. He said he did once years back after kids reported seeing someone in the windows. He didn't find anyone, but his deputy quit 2 days later, swearing he'd seen a woman standing by the stove. Said she smiled at him and asked if he wanted breakfast. I went back the next morning. I shouldn't have, but the story wasn't finished, and something about that place felt unfinished too. The mist was thick again, and the smell hit me as soon as I cut the engine. This time, though, it wasn't just biscuits and coffee. There was bacon, too, frying low and slow. I stepped up onto the porch, recorder in hand. "This is Pine Hollow Farm," I said quietly. "No signs of life, but it smells like breakfast again. If anyone's here." The door opened by itself. The sound that came next wasn't words exactly, more like a breath, soft and close to my ear. It said, "You're late." Inside, the kitchen table was clean. Plates gleamed like new. The chairs were upright and the kettle on the stove was whistling gently. I don't remember sitting down, but I must have, because when I blinked, I was at the table and the mug in front of me was full. The coffee was black and hot and the biscuits looked perfect. Across from me sat the woman from the photo. Her hair was gray now, her face thin but kind. She smiled, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Earl's in the barn," she said softly. "He'll be in soon." I tried to speak, but my throat felt full of smoke. The wall seemed to breathe, and from somewhere outside came the sound of a man chopping wood, steady and rhythmic. I realized what was wrong. The air didn't feel stale anymore. It was warm, alive. The house wasn't abandoned. The woman looked at me like a mother looks at a child who's forgotten his manners. "Eat," she said. "You must be hungry." When I finally tore my eyes from her, the plate was empty. Crumbs on the table, coffee gone. My hands were shaking. She stood and turned toward the stove, humming that same song, the one I'd heard before. I left without remembering how. I only remember the road, the pine trees leaning over me, the sky turning pink as the sun came up. When I got back to town, my tape recorder was still running. I played it back that night. The only sound it caught was a man's voice near the end, low and dry like wind through a cornfield. He said, "We're always here at breakfast." The next morning, I drove by the turnoff to Pine Hollow Farm. The road was blocked by a fallen pine. The mailbox was gone, but the air smelled like biscuits and coffee again. And this time I didn't stop. I heard later that a family tried to buy the property a few months after I left Jasper County. They stayed one night. The realtor said they left before dawn, their truck still running, the table inside set for two. Every spring, the county sends someone out to mow the weeds, but no one stays long. They say when you get too close, the air starts to change. Warm, inviting, almost human. And just when you think it's safe, you hear a kettle whistle, and someone behind you says, "Sit down now. You're just in time for breakfast." There's a road off Highway 30, between Huntsville and the Sam Houston National Forest that most folks don't take anymore. It's called Old Waverly Road, and it winds through stretches of pine so thick they choke out the sun even at noon. There used to be a community out there once, a settlement older than Walker County itself. Now all that's left is a scatter of collapsed porches, leaning chimneys, and one house that still stands when it shouldn't, the Waverly House he first. Saw it in the summer of 2019. I was doing freelance surveying for a development company that had bought a few hundred acres along that stretch. They wanted to map old property lines before putting up cabins and rental retreats. It was honest work, quiet and steady, the kind that lets you forget how empty the woods can be until the silence starts sounding like a pulse. The Waverly House came up on one of my scans, just an irregular shape on satellite imaging, buried under vines. The map labeled it as abandoned structure, exterior, 1892. The others were just foundations, but this one still cast a shadow. I should have ignored it. But curiosity's a dangerous thing out there, especially when the forest feels like it's watching you back. It took me 2 hours to reach it, trekking through thickets that clawed at my jeans and boots. The air was heavy, damp with the kind of humidity that makes you feel like you're being breathed on. The vines weren't just growing around the house, they were devouring it. Thick ropes of ivy crawled up the porch columns and through the cracked windows, curling over the eaves like fingers. The door wasn't locked. When I pushed it open, it moaned like something waking from a long, bad dream. The air inside smelled of mildew and something older, sweeter, like the rot of fruit left too long in a bowl. The floors were warped, the wallpaper was hanging in strips, and yet there was furniture still in place. A dining table, 2 chairs, a mirror on the far wall that didn't belong to the ruin around it. The mirror was strange, oval with a carved oak frame darkened by age. It was spotless, though the rest of the room was drowned in dust. When I looked in, the reflection wasn't quite right. The furniture behind me looked newer, solid, upright, no rot or cobwebs. The wallpaper was whole again, the color richer, and there were people, a man in suspenders standing by the fireplace, a woman sitting at the table with her hair tied in a neat bun. Neither of them moved. Their faces were pale, hollow somehow, as if painted without pupils. I turned around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the woman was staring directly at me. That was enough for one day. I backed out and made a note in my log. Abandoned, unsafe structure. No salvageable interior. I told myself I'd tell the company to leave it off the plans, but that night, back in my motel room, I kept thinking about it. The way the woman's face had sharpened as I left, her mouth opening slightly like she was trying to say something. Around midnight, I gave up trying to sleep and started researching. Old Waverly, 1892. Turns out the house had belonged to the Duran family. They'd been one of the founding settlers in the area. Came from Alabama, bought up land, raised cattle. Then in 1892, something happened. The mother, Clara Duran, reportedly went mad and murdered her husband and their 2 children with an iron poker. Locals said they found her in the parlor, kneeling before the mirror, covered in blood and muttering about what she saw in the glass. She was hanged 2 weeks later. The mirror was mentioned again in a 1915 article, when the house was briefly occupied by squatters. They claimed the mirror showed the old family as they were before the killing, and that at midnight the scene rewound. I should have stopped reading right there. But something about it got under my skin. The next day I went back. The air was colder this time, though it was still early August. The forest was quiet. Too quiet, not even the whine of cicadas. The door creaked open like it had been waiting for me. The smell was stronger, earthy like soil and iron. I went straight to the mirror. This time the reflection didn't show me at all. It showed the room bright and alive again, just like before. The woman, Clara, was standing near the window brushing her hair. The man was sitting at the table reading a newspaper. 2 children played on the floor, rolling a wooden ball back and forth. Then the sound started, soft at first like wind whistling through cracks, but it grew into something else. A voice. It was coming from the mirror, not the room. A woman whispering, her words thick and warped as though the air on the other side was heavier. "He sees," she said. "He's watching from the wrong year." The children froze in the reflection. The man lowered his paper. Clara turned, and all 3 of them looked straight toward me. Though their eyes didn't quite align, they seemed to look through me, beyond me. The glass rippled, and for a second I thought I saw myself, standing there beside them in their world, pale and motionless. Something wet dripped onto my shoulder. When I touched it, my fingers came back red. Blood was seeping through the ceiling boards above. I stumbled back, tripping over a loose floorboard. The sound of footsteps echoed overhead, slow and deliberate, though the house had no second floor that I could see. I ran. I didn't even bother shutting the door behind me. The forest outside looked different somehow, thicker, darker, like the path had rearranged itself. It took me nearly an hour to find my way back to the trail. That night I packed my gear and checked out of the motel. I didn't report the house to the company. I figured they'd bulldoze it eventually or the forest would finish swallowing it. But last week I got a call. The number was local, unlisted. The man on the line said he'd found my old survey file. He was with a team clearing land for a new development, right where I'd marked the Waverly property. He asked if I'd be willing to confirm the coordinates before demolition. I told him no. He laughed and said they'd already been inside anyway, just to take pictures. He mentioned something odd, though. He said the photos didn't come out right. Every image was overexposed except one, the one of the mirror. He sent it to me. In the photo, the room looks perfect, restored. The table's clean, the chair's upright. But standing near the doorway, half hidden in the reflection, is a man with a camera bag slung over his shoulder and blood running down his arm. I don't own that bag anymore. I left it behind in the house that day, and the timestamp on the photo? It says August 11th, 1892. The drive to Hickory Bend Farm feels longer than it should. There's something about the back road south of Bastrop that makes you feel like you're looping through the same stretch of woods over and over, even when the GPS swears you're moving forward. I'd been hired to inspect the old farmhouse for a potential buyer, a developer from Austin who wanted to tear it down and rebuild. Said he didn't believe in haunted property nonsense. I told him ghosts weren't part of my report, but now I wish I'd lied. By the time I turned off the county road and onto the dirt lane, the sky was sliding into dusk. The air was thick with the smell of pine and something else underneath, something old and wet like turned soil. Hickory Bend sat back about half a mile from the main road, hidden behind drooping oak branches and tangles of honeysuckle. The house looked like it had been built in pieces over the years, each addition stitched on like a patch over rot. The paint had peeled down to gray planks and the porch sagged under the weight of decades. The first thing I noticed wasn't the smell or the silence. It was the porch light. It flickered, paused, then blinked again. 3 short bursts. 3 long. 3 short. SOS. Then a longer sequence, something deliberate, patterned, timed with eerie precision. At first I thought it was just faulty wiring, but when I took out my phone to film it, I realized it wasn't random at all. I used to be a Boy Scout, I knew Morse code. The message repeated again and again, "Help me bury him." I felt the chill crawl up the back of my neck like someone had dragged an ice cube down my spine. I shut off the engine and sat there for a while, staring at that flickering bulb. When it paused, the night seemed to hold its breath too, like the house itself was waiting to see if I'd understood. I should have driven away right then, but my job was to document structural integrity, wiring, insulation, things that could be fixed, and money was tight. So I got out, grabbed my flashlight, and made my way up the creaking steps. The porch boards groaned under my boots and the smell of earth got stronger, not just soil, like something had been dug up and left to rot. There was a thin trail of mud across the boards leading to the door, streaked like it had been dragged by a boot heel. The doorknob was loose, but when I turned it, the door opened easily as if it had been waiting. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with dust. My flashlight beam caught old furniture draped in sheets, walls warped from years of humidity, and floors stained in places I didn't want to think about. I started the usual routine, checking foundation lines, roof joints, noting signs of termite damage, but my mind kept going back to the message. "Help me bury him. Who was him?" Then the light flickered again inside the hallway, like the bulb was mocking me. I looked up at the ceiling fixture and saw that it wasn't even connected to the power grid. The whole house had been without electricity for years, according to county records, yet the porch light outside kept flashing steady as a heartbeat. In the back of the house, there was a kitchen that looked like it had been frozen in time. Dishes still stacked in the sink, a cracked coffee mug on the counter, and a calendar on the wall turned to October 1974. There was a dark patch on the linoleum near the stove, brown and uneven, but too old to tell what it once was. A single chair was pulled out from the table like someone had been sitting there waiting. I was about to jot down a note when I heard it, the faint click of a light switch, then the sound of the porch bulb buzzing to life again through the window above the sink. I looked out. It was blinking the same words. "Help me bury him," I whispered. "Who?" Before I could stop myself. The light flickered once, paused, then blinked back. Backyard. The wind picked up outside, rattling the tin roof. I should have called someone, the sheriff maybe. But curiosity does strange things to a person when fear's already got its hooks in. So I went out the back door, cutting through knee-high grass until I reached the tree line. The moon had just started to rise, throwing pale light across the yard. Behind the house, near an old oak tree split by lightning, the ground looked uneven. There were patches of dirt that didn't match the rest, looser, darker, fresher somehow, even though nothing about this place had been touched in decades. I knelt down, brushing my hand across the soil. It was damp. The smell hit me again, thick and rotten like decay trapped in a wet blanket. That's when I saw the shovel leaning against the oak. It was half buried in the dirt, metal rusted but still sharp at the edge. There were initials carved into the handle, EM. I didn't know what they stood for, but they were gouged in deep, angry strokes. Then I heard it. A voice low and close to my ear, like someone whispering through cupped hands, "Please, finish what he wouldn't." I spun around, light sweeping over the yard, but there was no one there. Just the whisper of wind through the trees and the hum of insects that suddenly went quiet. I looked back at the porch and the light blinked again. "Help me bury him." The words pulsed faster this time, almost frantic. I don't remember deciding to dig. It was like my body moved before my brain did, like something had taken hold of me. The shovel hit the dirt with a dull thud, and with every scoop, that smell grew stronger until it wrapped around me like a fog. My hands blistered, my arms ached, but I couldn't stop. Then the blade struck something solid. Wood, old rotted wood. I knelt down and scraped the soil away with my hands. A box. Too small to be a coffin, but too big to be anything else I could explain away. I pried at the edge until the lid gave way. Inside was a man's suit jacket, folded neatly around a collection of bones. They weren't arranged like they'd been buried properly, more like they'd been thrown in a hurry. One arm bone was bent, the skull cracked clean through the crown. The jacket still had a sheriff's badge pinned to it. Bastrop County, 1974, then came the sound. A single creak from the porch steps. I looked up. The light was still flashing, but the rhythm had changed. It wasn't Morse anymore, just steady pulses, on and off, on and off. like a heartbeat. I stood up, backing away from the hole, and that's when I saw her. A woman standing under the porch light barefoot, wearing a tattered nightgown that shimmered faintly under the bulb's glow. Her face was pale and hollow, eyes dark as the soil I'd just unearthed. She lifted one hand and pointed toward the open grave. "He wouldn't stay down," she said. Her voice sounded like it had been scraped raw. "Help me finish it." I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the hole. "Who was he?" I shouted. Her eyes flicked toward the badge in my hand. "My husband. Sheriff Emmett Moore. He killed them all. Buried them here. Said no one would ever find out. But he didn't bury himself deep enough." The porch light dimmed, and I could see now that her hands were caked in dirt, her fingernails broken. "I tried," she said, "but he keeps coming back. Every time someone digs here, every time the light comes on." The wind howled through the trees, carrying a sound that didn't belong to the night, like heavy boots dragging through the mud. I turned toward the open grave, and the dirt started shifting, moving like something was pushing up from beneath. A hand broke through first, gray and wet, fingers twitching, then the rest followed. A body half rotted but still moving, still breathing somehow through a mouthful of soil. The woman screamed. The porch light burst into a strobe, blinding white flashes spelling out the message one last time. "Help me bury him." I dropped the flashlight and grabbed the shovel. I didn't think, I just swung, again and again, until the thing in the grave stopped moving. When the silence returned, it felt too heavy to breathe in. By the time I came to my senses, dawn was breaking. The woman was gone. The porch light was dark. I filled the hole as best I could, my hands trembling the entire time, then stumbled back to my truck. When I looked up one last time before driving away, the light flickered once. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short SOS, then nothing. A week later, I filed my report. Structural damage, foundation instability, unfit for habitation. I didn't mention what really happened. But sometimes, when I drive past that stretch of road on late inspections, I can see the light from a distance. It blinks through the trees in perfect rhythm. "Help me bury him." And every time, I swear I can hear the faint scrape of a shovel in the dirt. In Palo Pinto County, there's an old 2-story farmhouse off a dirt road that locals call the Harper Place. Nobody lives there now, but sometimes when the wind moves just right, you can smell the metal. That sharp, iron scent like something bleeding out slow. People say the walls leak rust. Others say it isn't rust at all. The place sits at the base of a shallow hill where the Brazos bends, surrounded by pecan trees and dry pasture that turns brittle in summer. From the road, it looks ordinary enough, weathered but still standing, but if you walk close, you'll see that under the faded white paint, the siding looks wet, as if the house itself is sweating through its own decay. It used to belong to Thomas Harper and his wife June. This was sometime in the early 1950s, back when the land around mineral wells was dotted with small ranches and dairy barns. The Harpers bought the house cheap from a widow whose husband had vanished in a well collapse nearby. Thomas was a practical man, a veteran turned cattle hauler. June was quieter, often sick, though folks said she had the kindest face. They moved in the summer of '54, and within weeks June began writing to her sister about strange smells in the house, iron, mildew, and something like rain even when it hadn't rained for days. Thomas brushed it off. He patched the roof, replaced the wallpaper, even poured new concrete in the cellar. But the stains kept coming back. By October, the first real rain hit the valley. The red dirt turned to thick mud. The cattle groaned in the fields, and thunder crawled across the hills. When Thomas went down to check the cellar for leaks, he found the floor dry as dust. What caught his attention was a noise, a light pattering like rain falling on wood. But there was no hole, no water. Instead, when he looked closer, small white fragments were scattered near the drain grate in the corner. He thought they were rocks until he picked one up and saw the shape, curved, hollow, porous bone. He told June it was probably chicken bones washed in from outside. But June didn't believe him. She refused to step into the cellar again. Over the winter, she got worse. Neighbors said she looked pale, as if she were slowly rusting from the inside. One night, she told the woman next door that she could hear something behind the wallpaper. Not mice, but whispering, soft as breath, asking to be let out. When the neighbor laughed, June showed her the walls in the sitting room. Long streaks ran from the ceiling down to the baseboards, the color of dried blood mixed with rainwater. Thomas kept repainting, but the streaks always came back. When he finally tried to tear down the paper, he said the plaster underneath was wet, sticky to the touch, and the nails were rusted through though they'd been new. He swore the smell was coming from inside the walls. The spring of '55 brought the last storm anyone remembered them surviving. Lightning tore through the pasture, and the Harper barn caught fire. When the flames died, the sheriff came to find the Harpers gone. The house was locked from the inside. The only thing found was a wet stain by the cellar door and a half-empty jar of wallpaper paste on the table. For years, the place stayed empty. Farmers nearby said their wells went bad, the water turning orange with iron. A few teenagers broke in during the '70s, hoping for ghost stories. One boy came back pale, said he saw something like skin stretched across the cellar wall, thin as old parchment, twitching like it was breathing. Nobody believed him until his friends said the air down there was cold and smelled of copper. In the '80s, a man from Fort Worth bought the property to flip it. He stripped the wallpaper and found hundreds of rust-colored handprints on the plaster beneath, small and large, layered like the house had been touched by generations of invisible hands. The workers refused to finish after one of them cut his palm on a nail and the blood ran down the wall. Not down, but sideways, like the wall itself was drinking it. The man sold the place back to the county within the year. By the time I came across it, the roof was sagging, and vines had swallowed the porch. I'd been photographing abandoned places for a small Texas heritage project and got the key from the sheriff, who warned me not to go into the basement. I laughed it off. That afternoon, the sky was white with heat, cicadas screaming. I remember pushing open the door and hearing a faint pop like the air shifting. Inside, the wallpaper peeled in long curls. The smell was immediate. Damp metal, the tang of old nails, and something else, faint but unmistakable, rot. I walked through the parlor, past a piano missing half its keys, and into the kitchen. The walls there were stained too, but in streaks that looked deliberate, like something had flowed upward. My camera's flash caught tiny flecks that shimmered red. The cellar door was at the back near a pantry that still held jars of rusted lids. The door hung crooked, but when I pulled it open, the hinges screamed. The smell deepened like a storm was about to break underground. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing old shelves, a broken chair, and what looked like the drain Thomas had written about in his old letters, which I'd read in an archive later. The floor was cracked concrete, dry and powdery except for one patch that looked damp. I crouched and touched it. It wasn't wet. It was warm. Then I heard it. Faint at first, a sound like raindrops, tap, tap, tap. I aimed my light at the ceiling, but it wasn't water. Tiny white fragments were falling, clattering softly across the floor. They were bones and small, brittle, like from birds or hands. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, and that's when I saw the wall behind the drain. The concrete was darkening, spreading in a shape almost like a shadow of a man, the edges dripping red as though the house itself was bleeding. I ran out into the yard, the air thick with heat. The wind had died, but I could hear thunder miles off. By the time I reached my truck, the first fat drops of rain hit the windshield, brown with dust. When I looked back, the light from the porch flickered on, though there hadn't been power in years. The stains on the siding seemed to move like something inside was pressing against the walls. As I drove off, the smell followed me, that same iron tang in the rain. Later that night, the sheriff called. He said the road by the Harper place had flooded out after the storm, and that a few bones had washed up near the culvert. He told me to stay clear until they sorted things. But no report ever surfaced, no excavation, nothing. The county closed off the road months later, citing erosion. The house still stands behind the trees, invisible unless you know exactly where to look. Locals say when it rains, the whole place hums, the air thick with the scent of rust. And sometimes, if you stand by the old fence line and listen, you can hear that soft patter again. Not rain, not quite. Like 1,000 tiny bones falling gently against the earth, trying to be remembered. They say you can hear the windmill before you ever see it. That low groaning spin turning backward against the stillness, like something down below was pulling it from the other side. Caldwell's Acre sits a few miles off Highway 79, past a stand of dying pines and a fence line that's half buried under sand. It's not marked on any map anymore. The county stopped acknowledging it after '47, the year the last Caldwell was buried. Or maybe just disappeared, depending on who you ask. When I first drove out there, I wasn't chasing ghosts or stories. I was chasing a photograph. I was doing a piece for a Texas Backroads magazine, the kind that glorifies rust and loneliness. Forgotten acres of East Texas. I'd heard about the old Caldwell property from a retired surveyor who said the place still had a windmill that spun even when the air was dead calm. He said it turned backward like the wind was coming from underground. I laughed it off, thinking it was one of those local exaggerations, but he gave me a look that stopped the joke cold. "You'll see," he said, "and when you do, don't stand too close to the well." The drive out was uneventful at first. The trees along the highway were bowed low, the bark pale and stripped in patches. When I turned off onto the dirt road, my tires kicked up dust that hung in the air without drifting. That should have been my first clue. The air wasn't moving at all. No breeze, no sound of birds. Even the heat felt heavy, pressing down instead of radiating up. The house came into view over a slope of dry grass. It was a 2-story frame structure with a porch sagging on one end, all gray boards and broken shutters. The paint had long peeled off, leaving the wood to splinter and silver. But what caught my attention wasn't the house. It was the windmill. The tower was still standing tall beside the old water tank, its metal blades catching the faint sunlight like a dozen dull knives. And sure enough, they were spinning, slow, steady, and counterclockwise, against the way the wind should move. Only there was no wind, not even a whisper. I parked the truck, grabbed my camera, and stepped out. The air felt thick, like standing in a room that hadn't been opened in years. My boots crunched on soil that was powder dry. Every sound I made seemed to echo longer than it should. I looked up again at that windmill and thought I could hear something faint beneath the groan of its turning, something rhythmic, almost like breathing. The front door was unlocked, swinging inward when I pushed it. Inside smelled of dust and old metal. There were no furnishings left except for a wooden chair in the corner and a stove whose pipe had rusted through. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips. The pattern underneath looked like vines, but when I brushed it with my fingers, the flakes that came off were dark red. Rust, I thought at first, until I noticed it left a faint stain on my skin that didn't wipe away. There were photographs still hanging in the hallway. The Caldwells, I assumed. Men in suspenders, women with hair tied back tight, all of them staring dead ahead like they were waiting to be told to breathe. One photo was of the windmill itself, newly built, and below it a man with a shovel standing next to a circular patch of stonework, the well. The same one sitting a few yards out back. I took a few shots and stepped through the back door. The grass around the well was dry and brittle, gray instead of green. The stones forming its ring were blackened as if from fire. The windmill above it turned slow and steady, and with every revolution I could hear a soft creak echo from inside the well, like a rope winding over wood. I crouched beside it and aimed my flashlight into the darkness. The beam went down maybe 20 feet before it hit water, or what I thought was water. It wasn't reflecting the light properly. Instead, the beam seemed to bend and dull like shining through smoke. Then something shifted down there, a ripple, not upward but sideways, as if something beneath was sliding against the wall. I backed away. My camera strap caught the edge of the stone, and for a second I thought I heard a whisper. Faint but unmistakable. A man's voice, strained and distant, saying something like, "Keep turning." The moment I stepped away, the blades of the windmill groaned and began to pick up speed, still spinning backward, faster and faster until the metal whined. The air around me finally moved, but not in a way that made sense. It wasn't wind coming from above, it felt like it was pulling inward toward the well. I stumbled back to the porch, half tripping over a root. The boards beneath my feet vibrated. Through the open door I saw the wallpaper moving. The red stains were spreading, dark veins crawling upward in lines that formed a spiral, the same direction as the blades. I could hear the well groaning, the sound deepening into a low hum that rattled in my chest. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The windmill slowed to a halt, each blade creaking as it settled. The air went still again. I waited, my heartbeat echoing in the silence. Then from inside the well came a single sharp clang like metal hitting stone, the sound of a chain. I didn't plan to go down there, but curiosity can chew through fear if you stand still too long. I grabbed the flashlight again and leaned over the edge. The water, or whatever it was, had cleared. I could see something below now, about 10 feet down. A shape, metallic and round, almost like a bucket. But it wasn't. It was a helmet. And just as I realized that, it tilted upward. A face looked back at me from inside the darkness. Not a reflection. an actual face pale and swollen, eyes open wide as if caught mid-breath. Then the water erupted, spraying up in a single burst that hit my face with the stench of rust and rot. I ran. I don't remember grabbing my bag or getting in the truck. The next clear thing I recall was driving down that dirt road with the windmill fading in the rearview mirror. It was still spinning backwards, slow again, steady. When I got back to the motel in Palestine that night, I plugged in the camera and checked the photos. The house was there, the fields, the windmill. But the shots of the well, those were wrong. Each one was darker than the last. The final frame showing nothing but black except for a faint circle of light. And in that circle, what looked like a hand pressed against the lens. I deleted the photos and went to bed. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a sound outside. At first I thought it was rain, but it wasn't. It was the soft, steady creak of metal turning in the wind. I went to the window and saw the silhouette of something tall and spindly behind the trees. The blades turned slowly backward. The next morning I drove back out to the highway. I figured I'd take one last look from a distance, maybe convince myself I'd imagined it. But when I reached the turnoff, the road wasn't there. Just a fence line and a sign half buried in the dirt. Caldwell property, no trespassing, 1947. The land beyond it was nothing but scrub and empty field. No house, no windmill, no well. I asked around later. Talked to a man at the diner who said his grandfather had helped tear the place down in the 40s. Whole family died in that well, he said, stirring his coffee. Windmill was cursed. They said it kept turning till the day the sheriff filled it in with concrete. I told him I'd seen it still standing. He looked at me for a long time before shaking his head. Then you weren't supposed to, he said. Sometimes the ground gives back what it doesn't want to keep. I left Anderson County that afternoon. I've never gone back. But on still nights when I drive the empty stretches of road and the air goes dead calm, I swear I can hear that same slow creak somewhere out in the dark. Metal blades turning backward against the wind, waiting for someone else to listen close enough to hear the chain start to move again. They say the Denton place was cursed long before the last stone of its foundation was laid. That something about that stretch of land outside Nacogdoches never wanted to hold human life for long. It sits back off a quiet county road now, barely visible through the thicket and pine, but every spring people still drive out there, park by the ditch, and stare at the clearing where the farmhouse once stood. Wildflowers bloom there earlier than anywhere else. Bluebonnets, Indian paintbrush, evening primrose. But they grow in such a strange pattern that it makes your stomach knot to look at it. They spell out one word, clear as handwriting across the earth: sorry. Old-timers say it started in 1932 when the first Dentons arrived from Louisiana. Thomas and Ida Denton bought the acreage cheap, desperate to start over after losing their youngest boy to scarlet fever. The land was fertile, with a spring-fed pond and rows of cedar fencing left behind from whoever farmed it before. The house they built was modest but sturdy, white-painted planks and a wraparound porch that looked out toward the road. They grew corn and kept chickens and lived quietly for almost a decade, until everything began to rot from the inside out. It started with the animals. The hens quit laying. The cows stood at the far end of the pasture staring toward the woods, lowing softly until dusk. Then came the well. The water went cloudy, leaving a thin red film on the bucket that smelled faintly of metal. The local wellman swore the spring was clean, but he couldn't explain why every bucket drawn from it turned rusty overnight. Ida took to boiling rainwater after that, and when the first child went missing, a neighbor's boy helping haul hay, no one wanted to come near the Dentons again. By 1941, the family had withered down to just Ida and her daughter, Ruth. Thomas had hung himself in the barn a year before. The same morning they found his plow mule dead with its eyes wide open and no sign of a wound. The sheriff's report said, self-inflicted. But the way folks told it, Thomas had carved something into the barn door first. A single word nobody could read because the boards were already black with age. Ida wouldn't leave the farm. She said she'd promised the land she'd stay until it was done with them. People took that to mean she'd gone mad with grief, and maybe she had. When the house burned in the spring of '47, no one called the fire department. There were no phone lines that far out, and by the time someone saw the glow from the highway, the entire structure was gone. Only the stone foundation remained, scorched black and cold by morning. They found Ida's bones in the ashes by what had been the kitchen, her hands curled around a rusted locket. They never found Ruth. Not her body, not her shoes, not a trace. But someone noticed weeks later that the grass around the ruins refused to grow until the first wildflowers came in. That's when people realized the blooms were arranged in a strange, deliberate way, like letters. Sorry. The county sheriff at the time, a man named R.L. Morgan, went out there himself that spring and wrote in his report that the flowers were indeed forming words. He thought maybe seeds had spilled from an old packet or some prankster had planted them, but he admitted the alignment was too clean, too uniform, and the soil inside the word's outline stayed darker, damper than anywhere else in the field. Every year afterward, the same thing happened. The same word. Always in the same place, always just as the dogwoods began to bloom. For decades, nobody touched that land. The Denton farmstead passed through estate auctions, foreclosure listings, and tax records, but no one ever claimed it. Surveyors who tried to mark it off complained of their compasses spinning and their GPS equipment failing. One crew chief from Lufkin swore he heard a woman crying somewhere beneath the soil, faint but steady, like she was trapped in a crawl space right under his feet. He quit surveying altogether the next week. When I moved to Nacogdoches for work in 2018, I didn't believe any of it. I'd grown up hearing ghost stories about the East Texas woods, about phantom hitchhikers and haunted bridges, and figured this was just another small-town legend. But when the wildflowers came in that first spring, I drove out there one Saturday with my camera. I parked on the shoulder where the asphalt turned to gravel and walked through the pines until the trees opened up into that strange, empty clearing. You could still see the outline of the old foundation, a low rectangle of limestone half buried under dirt and weeds. The air was hot and heavy, thick with the smell of cedar and something faintly sweet like decay masked with perfume. And sure enough, the flowers were there, thousands of them, covering the ground in bright waves of blue and red and gold. From a distance they looked random, but when I climbed up on a fallen pine trunk and looked down, the letters were unmistakable. Sorry. Neat, even, the lines curling slightly like a woman's handwriting. The soil inside the word was black, almost oily. I crouched down, scooped some in my hand. It was damp even though there hadn't been rain in weeks. I thought I heard something under me then, a soft scraping like fingers moving through gravel. It came once, then stopped. I stood still for a long time, listening, but all I could hear was the low hum of insects and the wind through the grass. I backed away, slow, half laughing at myself, but I didn't stop looking over my shoulder until I was back by the car. That night, when I went through the photos, something caught my attention. In every frame, the flowers were a little different. Not wildly, but enough that when I flipped through the images in sequence, the letters seemed to shift, like the word was being rewritten between shots. On the final photo, taken just as the sun dipped, it no longer read, sorry. It read, stay. I told myself it was the angle, a trick of light, and shut the laptop. 2 nights later, I woke to a scratching at my window. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, and there was nothing outside that window but open air. But the sound was real. Slow, deliberate, like someone dragging a nail along the glass. I froze, listening. Then it stopped, and I heard something fall onto the floor below, a soft patter. In the morning, I found a single bluebonnet lying on the tile by the window, its stem still damp with dew. I didn't sleep well after that. Every few days, I'd find another flower somewhere it didn't belong. The dashboard of my truck, the pocket of my jacket, once even inside my refrigerator. Always fresh, always wet, as if just pulled from the soil. The final time was in late April, when I woke to find them covering my bedroom floor in a perfect ring. I stepped into them barefoot, feeling the petals crush beneath my feet, and for a moment the scent of wildflowers was overwhelming. Then I realized the carpet was damp again, darker where the flowers lay. I knelt down and touched the floor. It wasn't water. It was cold, metallic, and red. I left town the next day. I didn't tell anyone why. Just packed what I could fit in the car and drove east until the pine woods thinned and the air lost that heavy sweetness. I never went back to Nacogdoches, but sometimes in spring I'll catch a glimpse of bluebonnets growing in places they shouldn't. Between cracks in the sidewalk, on the side of a parking lot, always arranged in loose curving lines. The last time it happened, I almost didn't look, but I did, and when I stepped back, I saw the word they formed at my feet. Welcome. When I first saw the Holloway place, it was nothing more than a sagging shell at the end of a dirt road, lined with black oaks and whispering mesquite. The grass had swallowed the gravel drive, and the mailbox had long since leaned into the ditch, its door hanging open like a mouth gasping for breath. The house itself sat low on the land, boards grayed by decades of weather, windows dark and hollow as if the place had been blind for a long time. I'd been hired by a man named Kurt Hensley, a real estate developer out of Dallas who thought he could flip forgotten country properties for weekenders looking for authentic Texas charm. He sent me out there to photograph it, appraise the foundation, and see whether it could still be saved. But I didn't tell him that I'd already heard the stories. In Fannin County, everyone had. They said the Holloway family vanished sometime in 1978. Neighbors reported strange sounds at night, lights in the windows long after the power was cut. And then one morning the mailman found the front door open, the truck still in the yard, and breakfast half finished on the table. Eggs congealed in the pan, toast burnt, chairs pulled halfway out. Nobody ever found the family, though their belongings were left scattered as if they'd gotten up mid-conversation and walked into the woods. I didn't believe in ghost stories, not really, but the place carried a weight, even from the road. The first time I stepped inside, the air was so still it felt like it might collapse if I breathed too hard. My boots sank slightly into the warped pine boards. There was nothing left, no furniture, no curtains, just pale rectangles on the walls where pictures had once hung. The faint scent of rot and something sweet hung in the air like decaying fruit. I remember brushing a spiderweb from my face and hearing something slide faintly upstairs. I froze, listening. Just the house settling, I told myself. But then came another sound, faint but distinct. The dull scrape of something heavy shifting across the floor above me. I climbed the staircase, my flashlight beam trembling over the banister. Every step groaned under my weight. The upper hall opened into 3 rooms, all empty, all quiet. I checked each one, slow and thorough. Nothing but dust and the occasional moth fluttering near the light. I was about to laugh at myself when I heard it again, this time from below. A dragging sound, steady and deliberate, coming from the front room I'd just left. I hurried down the stairs, heart thudding, the floorboards creaking beneath me. My flashlight swung through the gloom and landed on the parlor. It was empty, completely empty, but the dust told a different story. Across the floor, where there should have been undisturbed powder, there were wide streaks cutting through it, long curving marks like something heavy had been pulled from one corner to another. My breath caught. I knelt and touched one. The dust was fresh, disturbed within the last few minutes. I backed toward the door, ready to step outside when I saw them. Faint impressions near the wall. The outline of a couch pressed into the wood, a rectangular shadow like the ghost of a coffee table, and beside the window, a worn spot where a rocking chair might have stood. They were only slight discolorations, like the wood itself remembered what used to sit there. But the strangest thing was the sound that came next. Faint, rhythmic, unmistakable, the creak of that invisible rocker moving back and forth. That was the first night. When I told Hensley what I'd found, he laughed and said I'd been spooking myself. But he wanted more photos, so he told me to stay a few nights in town and get some shots at dusk and dawn. He thought that kind of light sold better to city buyers. I checked into a small motel in Bonham and drove back out each day. The second evening, I brought along my equipment: tripod, long exposure lenses, a drone, and a portable floodlight. The sun was just bleeding out behind the trees when I set up in the front yard. Inside, I noticed something that made my scalp prickle. The drag marks were different. The streaks in the dust were gone, replaced by new ones crossing in a different pattern. The ghostly outlines on the floor had deepened, darkened somehow, like the shapes had been sanded into the grain. I stood there in silence for a long time, the fading light stretching shadows through the windows. Then from the hall I heard the faint scrape again, this time closer. It was a slow pull, like a legless animal crawling across the floor. I turned toward the sound and saw nothing, but then came another from the opposite corner, and another behind me. I swung the flashlight in a frantic arc, but the room stayed empty. The noises stopped. I waited, heart pounding, breath shallow. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Dust lifting off the floorboards, a faint swirl rising and settling again, as if something invisible had just passed through. I grabbed my camera and bolted outside. But the strangest part came when I reviewed the photos later that night in my motel room. In the first few, the room was as I'd left it. Bare walls, cracked floor, But in the last one, something new had appeared. It was subtle at first, just the faint silhouette of a chair leg, half translucent, emerging from the corner of the frame. In the next shot, a couch arm. In the third, the full outline of a room furnished like it had been decades ago, each object shimmering faintly, like it was half made of smoke. I didn't sleep that night. The third day, I went back again. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe, or stupidity. The air was colder that morning, the sky the color of ash. I opened the front door, and this time I didn't need the flashlight. The room was full again. Not completely, but enough that my knees went weak. A dusty couch sat against the far wall, one leg missing. A table stood upright near the window, crooked but solid. A single rocking chair swayed gently in the draft, though the air was still. It was as if the house was rebuilding itself piece by piece, dragging the memory of its belongings back from somewhere unseen. I backed away, but before I reached the porch, I heard something upstairs again. Not dragging this time, but footsteps. Slow, deliberate, pacing the floor above me. My voice came out rough when I called, "Hello?" No answer. I called again, louder. The steps stopped. The silence that followed pressed in hard. Then faintly a new sound. Wood scraping against wood like a dresser being pushed into place. Then another, heavier, like a bed frame being dragged across the floor. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, the noise had stopped. But the master bedroom door was open now, and inside, what I saw nearly stopped my heart. The room looked lived in. The bed was there, sagging but intact. The dresser stood against the far wall, a cracked mirror above it. And on the nightstand, beneath a film of dust, lay a framed photo of the Holloway family. Father, mother, 2 children. Faces faded but clear enough to recognize from the missing persons file I'd read online. Then the bed shifted. Not much, just a faint shudder. But it was enough to send me stumbling backward. The room's air thickened, pressing on my chest like a weight, and from the corner, faint and whispering, came a voice. It wasn't distinct, more like the echo of someone trying to speak through water. I caught fragments. "We stay home, please, miss," but never the full sentence. I ran, tripping down the stairs, and didn't stop until I reached the truck. That night I checked out of the motel and drove back toward Dallas. But halfway down Highway 82, I stopped at a gas station to call Hensley. I told him the property wasn't worth saving. I told him to tear it down. He just laughed, said I was being dramatic, and told me he'd send another inspector. A week later, he called me back. His voice was shaky. He said the second guy hadn't come back. The man's truck was still in the driveway, keys in the ignition, doors locked from the inside. The sheriff found the front door of the house wide open again. Inside, everything was gone. Every last piece of furniture, every photo, every scrap of evidence that the Holloways or anyone else had ever lived there. Just bare floors and dust. But here's the thing, and I still can't explain it. Sometimes when the night's quiet enough and the wind blows down from bottom, people swear they can hear the old place groaning. They say the furniture's still moving in there, dragging itself across the floor, finding the exact same spot it's always known. Some say the Holloways came back home, not as ghosts but as memories caught in the wood, replaying the night they vanished over and over again. I've never been back, but last week I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. No subject, no message body, just an attached photo. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was a picture of the living room at the Holloway property, fully furnished, lamps glowing, everything neat and perfect. And in the reflection of the window, I could see someone standing there holding a camera. It was me. On the western edge of Comanche County, past a line of leaning fence posts and fields that roll like waves when the wind comes off the plains, lies a stretch of land called Fisher's Field. It's not on any map anymore, not since the county rerouted the road in the 70s, and most folks only find it when they aren't looking for it. The field's about 20 acres wide, bordered by oak and mesquite, and divided down the center by a faint furrow that looks too straight and deliberate to be natural. They say if you walk that line at dusk, you'll hear boots following you, heavy, one step behind. That's what my uncle told me the first time we drove out there, back when I was 17 and thought ghost stories were for kids. The old man who owned the land before us was named Ray Fisher. The stories say he was a quiet type, a farmer who worked the land hard after his wife died in childbirth. He didn't take kindly to strangers, and by the end, he didn't talk to anyone at all. Folks said he'd walk that field every evening, pacing the same path over and over, whispering to himself. When they found him dead in his barn, his boots were lined with soil from that same furrow and the soles were worn almost through. They buried him on his property because no one else wanted to claim him. A year later, the field went up for auction, and my uncle bought it for next to nothing. He said it was just land, same as any other. But it wasn't. Not long after he moved his trailer out there, he started hearing things. Soft steps crunching behind him when he was feeding his dogs at night, or the faint jingle of spurs when he walked back from the tree line. He laughed it off, said it was coyotes or maybe kids from town trying to spook him. Then one evening he called me, said he didn't want to be alone out there. When I got there, the sun was already sinking, washing the fields in that copper light you only get before dark. He was standing by the line, just a faint grassless strip cutting across the ground like a scar. He told me to listen. At first I thought he was just trying to mess with me because all I heard was the wind. But then, clear as day, came the sound of boots in the dirt. Slow, deliberate, matching our steps but always half a beat behind. I turned around. Nothing there. Just open field and the smell of dust. I wanted to leave, but my uncle wouldn't budge. He said he needed to walk the line just once more to see if it was real. I followed him, the sound keeping pace with us close enough that I could almost feel the ground tremble. When we reached the far end, the noise stopped. The air was dead still, not even the cicadas buzzing. Then from behind us, a voice said, "You shouldn't have come back." I don't remember running, just the sound of my uncle yelling my name and the crack of something heavy hitting the ground. When I turned around, he was gone, vanished into thin air. I searched until my throat went raw from shouting, but there wasn't a single footprint except mine. The next morning, the sheriff came out, found his truck, his dogs, even his half-drunk coffee on the porch, but no sign of him. They searched the fields for 3 days, nothing. They wrote it off as another missing person, which wasn't unusual out here. After he disappeared, the county marked the land as condemned. Said there were sinkholes forming, unsafe for habitation. But the truth is, no one wanted to go near it. The few who did came back pale, quiet, their eyes hollow. One kid swore he saw a man walking that furrow at dusk, dragging one leg like it was broken, and every time he blinked, the man was closer. I didn't go back for years. Not until I inherited the property after they declared my uncle legally dead. I don't know why I went. Maybe guilt. Maybe curiosity. The field was just as I remembered. Empty, silent, that same dry wind cutting through. But the line looked deeper, darker, like the earth itself had been split open. I brought my flashlight, started walking. Every few steps I'd glance over my shoulder. Nothing, but I could hear it again. That slow, steady rhythm of boots behind me. Halfway through, my light flickered. I crouched to check the batteries, and when I stood, there was someone standing about 20 feet behind me. Tall, broad-shouldered, face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. I called out, asked who he was, no answer. He just stood there, breathing heavy, one hand hanging at his side, the other gripping something long and thin. I thought it was a cane until he started walking, dragging it through the dirt. The sound it made, metal against stone, set my teeth on edge. I backed away, my legs barely working, but he kept coming. I could see the outline of his boots now, thick, worn, caked with black mud. When the moon came through the clouds, I finally saw his face. Or what was left of it. The skin was sunken, the jaw slack, eyes like dull glass. And yet, when he spoke, the voice was unmistakable. It was my uncle. He told me he'd been walking the line for years. Said once you step onto it after dusk, it keeps you. You can leave the field, but something follows you home, whispering, waiting. Said the man who owned the land before him. Ray Fisher was still out there too, walking just ahead. And behind them were all the others who'd crossed that furrow and never made it back. I ran then. I didn't stop until I reached the truck, heart slamming in my chest. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw him standing at the edge of the field, hat in his hand, watching me go. He didn't follow. But when I got home, I found muddy prints across my porch, heavy boot-shaped, leading right up to my front door. For weeks afterward, I'd wake up at night to the sound of those same steps pacing the hall. Slow, patient, never closer than one room away. I tore up the floors, checked the attic, even called the sheriff. No one found anything. Then one night I heard the screen door creak open and the sound moved outside. Across the yard. Into the distance. Back toward Comanche County. I thought it was over. I really did. But a few days ago, my neighbor knocked on my door. Said his son had been camping near the old Fisher property. Said the boy came home white as a sheet, swearing he heard footsteps behind him as he walked the field line. The kid said they stopped when he did, started when he did, always one step behind. They say it's cursed land, but I don't think it's that simple. I think there's something buried under that field. Something that remembers every foot that's ever touched its soil. And maybe once you've walked the line, it remembers you too. If you ever find yourself in Comanche County and someone offers to show you Fisher's Field, don't go at dusk. Don't walk the line. Because if you do, you'll never walk alone again. In the early 60s, before the subdivision signs and paved cul-de-sacs, the Crenshaw house sat on a hill above a quiet patch of cedar and limestone west of Buda. It was built in 1918, a tall square farmhouse with a wraparound porch and wide, drafty rooms that creaked in rhythm with the wind. By the time the Crenshaws moved in after the war, the paint had already begun to peel. But Mr. Crenshaw was a stubborn man, the kind who believed in fixing what he owned, even if it took his whole life. He worked for the telephone company in Austin, one of the first to install home lines across Hays County, and that old farmhouse perched near the new poles and wires made him feel like he was living on the edge of progress. It was his wife Helen who started hearing it first, a lullaby, faint but clear, drifting through the baby's room just after sunset. The words were old-fashioned, something about angels keeping watch, the kind of melody that might have belonged to a church hymn or a front porch tune. She thought it was coming from outside, maybe a neighbor's radio, though there were only 2 houses within shouting distance. But each night it came again, always around the same time and always from the direction of the crib. Their baby, Clara, was only 8 months old then, a happy child by all accounts, but she'd go suddenly quiet when the sound began, as if she were listening. Sometimes she'd smile at nothing, her blue eyes tracking something invisible across the room. Helen didn't tell her husband at first. She was afraid he'd laugh, or worse, think she was tired and imagining things. It wasn't until one evening when he came home late, carrying his work bag and smelling like linseed and metal, that he heard it too. He stopped in the hallway outside Clara's room and froze. The melody was unmistakable, a woman's voice humming softly through the air, the kind of sweetness that crawls up your spine. But what unsettled him most was that it wasn't coming from the window or outside. It was coming from inside the baby's room, from somewhere near the cradle itself. When he stepped inside, the sound cut off instantly. He tore the room apart that night, pulling up floorboards, checking the walls, looking for wires or speakers or anything that could explain it. There was nothing. No radio, no hidden device, no source at all. For a few days, the lullaby didn't return. Helen thought maybe it had been the wind, or some trick of sound from the nearby hills. But then one afternoon while she was cooking supper, the baby monitor crackled. Now that in itself should have been impossible, because the baby monitor was nothing more than a pair of prototype transmitters Mr. Crenshaw had borrowed from work. The company had been experimenting with new home communication devices, crude things that looked more like oversized walkie-talkies than monitors. They didn't work half the time, but he'd rigged them up anyway so Helen could hear Clara from the kitchen. The voice that came through that day wasn't static. It wasn't interference. It was that same woman's lullaby, soft and measured, rising and falling like someone rocking a baby. When Mr. Crenshaw came home and heard it for himself, he disconnected the units, pulled the cords, even took the batteries out. The sound didn't stop. It played on, faint and steady, though now it seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the corners of the room, from the air vents, from the metal crib bars. After that, nothing in that house felt normal again. Lights flickered when the sun went down. Doors that had been locked were found standing open. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, Helen would wake to the rhythmic sound of something rocking in the nursery. Wood creaking, slow and steady, like a chair moving under invisible weight. Clara never cried during those moments. She only cooed as if being soothed. By midsummer, Mr. Crenshaw was sleeping in the truck some nights. He started staying late at work, claiming overtime, though everyone knew the company wasn't paying for it. Helen would stand on the porch at dusk, watching the field beyond the fence where the fog gathered low, listening for that faint hum that always preceded the voice. The final night came in late September, the air heavy with the smell of cedar and rain. Helen woke to the sound of Clara gurgling and laughing, not crying but laughing through the monitor. When she picked up the receiver, she heard another sound underneath the laughter. It wasn't humming anymore. It was whispering. A woman's voice, soft but urgent, speaking words Helen couldn't make out. She ran down the hallway and threw open the nursery door. The crib was empty. She screamed for her husband, who came running, his face white with sleep and confusion. They tore through the house calling for the baby, searching every room, every corner. Then Helen heard something above them, a muffled laugh faint from the attic. They climbed the narrow ladder together, each step creaking under their weight. The attic smelled like dust and old wood. It was dark except for the beam of the flashlight. In the far corner near the chimney stack sat Clara, rocking back and forth in a wooden chair neither of them had ever seen before. The child was humming the same lullaby. When Helen reached for her, the baby smiled and pointed toward the shadows beside the chair. Mr. Crenshaw swung the light around, but there was nothing there. Nothing visible, anyway. Still, both of them felt it, a shape, a pressure in the air, something watching them. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Helen could see her breath. He grabbed the baby and bolted for the ladder, yelling for Helen to follow. She turned to look one last time at the chair, and for a split second she saw her, a woman, thin and pale in a dress that shimmered like wet silk, sitting in the same rocking chair, cradling something in her arms. The look on her face wasn't cruel or angry. It was sorrowful. By morning they were gone. They packed up what little they could fit into the truck and left the house standing just as it was, dishes in the sink, clothes still hanging in the closets. They drove north and never came back. Neighbors said they'd left because of debt or family troubles, but those who went up to look after the place told different stories. They said the light still flickered some nights, that the rocking chair could be heard upstairs when the wind blew from the east. A few claimed they'd heard music, faint like a lullaby through a broken speaker. Years later, when the property changed hands, the new owners gutted the house. They tore down walls, replaced wiring, stripped everything to the studs. But during the demolition, one of the workers found something lodged behind a support beam in the nursery wall. A small, rusted transmitter no bigger than a matchbox, stamped with a logo from a company that wouldn't release its first baby monitor until 1968. The date on the device was 1959. Nobody could explain it. The engineers who examined it said it shouldn't have been capable of transmitting sound. It was missing components, no receiver, no power source, just a dead piece of metal and wire. The Crenshaw house still stands off an old county road, half hidden by cedar and wild grass. On quiet nights, people say you can still hear the faint hum of a lullaby carried through the air, as if the house itself remembers the sound. And if you stand outside long enough, listening, you might notice something stranger. The distant crackle of static, like an old radio turning on by itself, followed by a woman's voice whispering a name that isn't yours, but somehow makes you feel like it should be. In Kerr County, just north of the Guadalupe River, there's a narrow county road that winds past a stretch of cedar thickets and limestone outcrops, ending in a clearing where Mason Hill Farm sits alone on a rise. You wouldn't think much of it driving by. An old white farmhouse with flaking paint, a windmill that hasn't turned in decades, and a barn whose roof slumps like an old man's shoulders. But locals will tell you that no bird has landed there in living memory. Not on the fence posts, not on the power lines that cut across the property, not even on the chimney when the fire's burning. The air stays quiet around that place except for the wind. I first heard about Mason Hill from a friend who restores historic buildings. He said the land was being auctioned, and since I was looking for a rural property to photograph for a project on Texas Farmhouses, he suggested it. He mentioned the odd bird thing as a joke, saying it'd give the place character. So on an overcast afternoon in March, I drove out from Kerrville with my camera bag and a thermos of coffee. The road narrowed until the trees scraped my side mirrors, then opened suddenly into a clearing of yellowed grass and thin oaks. The farmhouse stood at the top of a low hill, its windows dark, its porch sagging but still whole. The air felt still, heavy somehow, like the sound had been drained out of it. I parked and got out, listening. Not a single chirp, not even a crow in the distance. I remember thinking it was odd, but not impossible. Maybe the air pressure before a storm was keeping the wildlife quiet. Still, when I looked up and saw the sky clear, I felt something else, like a hum under my ribs, faint but constant. I took my first few shots from the field, the farmhouse framed by the windmill and the dry fence line. It looked perfect through the lens, haunting in that way old Texas houses get, as if time had been scraped thin over the boards. Inside, the air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic. The front door groaned open with a sound that echoed through the house longer than it should have. The rooms were stripped bare except for a few broken chairs and a toppled dresser. Wallpaper peeled in long curls, revealing wood planks beneath. The kitchen floorboards had warped up like waves frozen mid-motion. I took photos of everything. Angles, light through cracks, doorways, but I kept catching my reflection in the viewfinder even when I wasn't near a mirror. It would flicker there for half a second, then vanish when I focused. I told myself it was a lens flare or autofocus confusion. It was old equipment after all. The oddest part was how the light behaved. It didn't move naturally. Shadows would lengthen even when the clouds hadn't shifted. In one room, the floorboards seemed darker toward the corners, as if the walls were soaking up the brightness. I was setting up for a long exposure of the hallway when the windmill outside gave a sharp creak. I thought maybe the wind had picked up, but when I looked out the window, the grass was still, not a breath stirring. The windmill turned once, a full rotation against the windless air, then stopped. I could swear I heard something faint when it moved, a soft, distant note like someone humming far away. That was when I noticed the photographs on the mantel. 4 frames, dusty but still upright, each showing the same family. Husband, wife, 2 kids. Their clothes looked 1940s, maybe early 50s, but all their faces had faded completely. The backgrounds were crisp, the house, the fields, the truck out front. But where their features should have been, the paper was blank white. Not even outlines. I thought maybe the photos had been damaged by sunlight or moisture. Still, it was unsettling to look at, like someone had erased them with care. I took pictures of those frames too, zoomed in on the faces. When I reviewed them on my camera, they looked the same, blank. I worked my way upstairs. The walls were painted pale green, faded into the color of ash. There were old bed springs in one room, a single wooden toy in another, a small horse missing its tail. The air grew colder as I reached the end of the hall, not like a draft, but cold that seeped from the walls. I stood in front of a door slightly ajar, and I could smell something sweet behind it, faintly floral like baby powder. I pushed it open. Inside was a small nursery. The crib was still there, though it leaned to one side. Above it, the ceiling had cracked into a wide, dark stain that spread outward like roots. I raised the camera, framed the crib, and clicked. The shutter didn't sound right, it echoed. I took a few more shots, trying to steady my hands. Then I heard a sound that made the hair rise on my arms. It was faint, soft, and lilting, a woman's voice humming a lullaby. The same note I'd heard from the windmill, only closer now, clearer. It came from behind the crib, from the dark stain spreading down the wall. I froze, trying to convince myself it was the wind through a vent. But there was no wind. I turned slowly, backing out of the room. The sound didn't stop. It followed me down the hall, growing softer only when I reached the stairs. I didn't run, not yet. I wanted to pretend I wasn't scared, that I could finish the job. I took one last shot of the hallway from the bottom of the stairs, then left. The air outside felt sharp and wrong, like it hadn't been breathed in a long time. The sky was still gray, but bright enough that I should have seen birds overhead. I didn't. I stayed long enough to photograph the barn, then packed up and drove back to town. By the time I reached my motel, the hum in my chest had stopped, replaced by a dull headache. That night I went through the photos on my laptop. The first few were fine, the exterior, the field, the porch. But when I reached the inside shots, something was wrong. In the ones from the living room, there were faint white smears near the corners like fog caught mid-motion. In the hall photos, the light was off, bending oddly around certain doorways. And in the nursery pictures behind the crib, the dark stain was shaped wrong. It wasn't random at all. It looked like a woman standing behind the crib, her head tilted, her hair hanging forward, her features just hints of shadow. But the worst part was the last photo I'd taken, the one of the hallway from the stairs. The blurred figure was closer now, standing halfway down the hall, one hand on the wall, her face still featureless, but her outline clearer, as if the camera had caught her in motion. I told myself it was a trick of exposure, that the old plaster walls had patterns that just happened to form that shape. But when I zoomed in, I saw that the camera's focus had locked onto something. The metadata even showed it. Subject detected. I shut the laptop and didn't open it again until morning. Over the next few days, the images changed. I don't mean digitally, they weren't corrupted files or anything. But when I printed them, the faces of the family in the mantel photos began to fade even more, until the outlines were gone completely. Then my own photos started doing it. In the first few self-timer shots I'd taken outside the house, my face began to pale. By the 5th day, I looked like a blur. By the 7th, I was gone entirely. Just the house behind me, the empty field, and no birds in the sky. I called my friend who'd told me about Mason Hill. He said something strange. The property had been auctioned, but the buyer backed out after the photographs they'd taken for appraisal kept losing the inspectors' faces too. He said it wasn't the first time that had happened. Every time someone tries to document that place, something wipes them out of it. He laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that lasts long. I deleted every image from my hard drive, burned the prints in a coffee tin behind the motel. But that didn't fix it. I started noticing it in other photos too. My driver's license, an old family picture in my wallet, even a Polaroid on my fridge back home. The color started draining from my face, first faintly, then completely. My reflection stayed but flat somehow, like it wasn't tethered to me right. I thought about going back, maybe to put whatever it was back where it came from, but I couldn't bring myself to drive that road again. Every night I dream of the farmhouse, the hum under the floor, and the windmill turning against the air. In the dream, the woman is standing on the porch now, looking out at the field, her blank face turned toward the road. They say no bird will land there because they know what's buried under the hill. The family, the first one who lived there, went missing in 1962. They say the wife was a photographer. Some people think she caught something she shouldn't have. Others say she learned how to make people fade from the world the same way she made them fade from pictures. I don't know which is worse, but I do know one thing. When I look in the mirror now, the glass feels colder every day, and sometimes faintly, just under the hum in my ears, I can hear a lullaby. The Wilcox homestead sat 10 miles east of Lufkin, off a county road that didn't appear on most maps. The gravel path wound through pine woods so thick they blocked the sun even at noon. The locals said the road changed length depending on who drove it. Some claimed it stretched for miles, others swore it ended too soon. But everyone agreed on one thing. The Wilcox place had been there long before the county was ever marked, and nobody stayed long enough to repaint the porch twice. I first saw it during a property survey in late July. The heat hung low that day, the air syrup thick with humidity, and the sound of cicadas was so constant it felt like the earth itself was humming. The house appeared suddenly around a bend, 2 stories of warped siding, its paint the color of sunburnt bone, its windows blind with grime. The porch sagged like an old man's mouth, and weeds had taken the steps entirely. But what struck me most wasn't the neglect, it was the doors. Every single one, from the front entrance to the side shed, had rusted padlocks fixed to the outside. Even the outhouse had a bolt across it. Inside was worse. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air felt wrong, too dense, like the walls were holding their breath. My flashlight beam caught the dust suspended midair, and for a second I thought I saw it move against the current. The wallpaper was peeling in strips patterned with faded violets, but beneath it ran dark stains that spidered out like veins. When I tried one of the inner doors, a narrow one beneath the staircase, it rattled but didn't give. I checked the frame and found another padlock. This one looped through a hasp on the outside, sealing it shut from where I stood. That was the first moment I realized how unnatural the layout was. Every interior door was secured the same way. Whoever lived here didn't want something locked in. They wanted to make sure nothing could come out. I'd been sent by a Lufkin real estate firm to inspect the structure. Old property, no active owner, but valuable acreage. They warned me not to go alone, but I shrugged it off. I'd done dozens of these. Abandoned farmhouses, collapsing barns, it was part of the job. The Wilcox homestead wasn't any different, or so I told myself. I started my report on the ground floor, taking photos and notes. In the parlor, the boards creaked underfoot with every step. A fireplace choked with ash stood cold in the center. On the mantel lay 3 framed photographs, their glass cracked. I wiped the dust away. The faces had faded to almost nothing, just ghostly outlines of what might have been a family, 2 adults and a child between them. Their heads were gone, bleached out as if erased by sunlight. I glanced toward the window to check for glare, but the sky outside had dimmed gray, and I realized with a start that the cicadas had gone silent. When I turned back, one of the photographs was on the floor, face down. I didn't hear it fall. The second floor was narrower, the hallway lined with 5 doors, all locked from the outside, same as below. The fourth one caught my attention. Carved into the wood around the frame were jagged letters, crude and deep like they'd been scratched with a nail. Keep praying. Below it, in a child's hand, "Don't listen to her." The fifth door at the end of the hall was different. It wasn't locked, but nailed shut with rough planks that crossed like a star. Someone had etched words into the board, scripture, though the letters were uneven and misspelled. "The blood is a sign. He shall pass over. Her tongue is a snake." I stood there for a long while, reading them by flashlight, until the beam flickered. The batteries were new. I shook it, and for a heartbeat the light caught something behind me, a shape low to the ground, half in shadow. I swung around. Nothing. Just the empty hall and the nailed door breathing faint drafts of air through its seams. But the smell had changed. The rot of old wood was now mixed with something sharp, like copper. I decided to call it a day. When I stepped back outside, dusk had fallen fast. My truck, parked by the gate, looked smaller somehow, swallowed by the trees. I locked up the porch door behind me, out of habit, I guess, and left. That night at the motel, I couldn't sleep. The images kept replaying. The child's handwriting, the smell, the way the silence felt heavier than sound. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. No number, just static. I hung up, but it rang again immediately. I answered this time, and though no one spoke, I could hear faint tapping. Slow, measured, like someone knocking on wood from far away. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2. It repeated once before the line went dead. The next morning, the real estate firm called asking for updates. I told them the property wasn't salvageable, too unstable, unsafe for habitation. They didn't argue. Apparently, I wasn't the first to say that. The last surveyor, a man named Glenn from Nacogdoches, had vanished after his inspection 6 years earlier. They'd found his truck near the tree line with the keys still in the ignition. I asked if they ever went inside to check for him. The woman on the phone hesitated before saying, "The doors were locked, all of them." That should have been the end of it. But a week later, I received a brown envelope with no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid, grainy, faded, but unmistakably of the Wilcox homestead. The photograph had been taken from inside the house facing the staircase. And though I hadn't taken any interior shots from that angle, I recognized the parlor furniture, the broken frame on the mantel. What froze me was the figure in the doorway at the bottom of the stairs. It was small, hunched with one hand pressed against the doorframe. Its face was white, featureless like overexposed film. I tried to ignore it, to throw the photo away, but curiosity has its own gravity. 2 nights later, I drove back out there. The road felt longer this time, the air heavier. When I reached the gate, I noticed the padlocks were gone, every one of them lying open in the dirt like shed skin. I almost turned around, but something in me needed to see that nailed room. Inside, the air had cooled. No smell, no insects, no sound. I climbed the stairs, each step bending beneath my boots. The scripture door was still there, but now one of the boards hung loose. The nail holding it had pulled out halfway, as if pried from the inside. I called out softly, "Anyone here?" The answer came from behind the other doors. Faint tapping again, rhythmic, deliberate. 3 paused too, then whispering, like someone repeating words they couldn't quite remember. I backed toward the stairs, heart hammering. The boards over the scripture door shuddered once, then again, the nails creaking. The whispering grew louder, more desperate. I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping over the threshold, but the front door slammed shut before I reached it. I yanked at the knob, it didn't move. Locked from the outside. Something moved overhead, slow, dragging steps across the floorboards above. Dust sifted down from the ceiling in lazy streams. I pressed my back to the wall, listening. The footsteps stopped directly above me. Then the whispering returned, now from the staircase itself, closer. Clearer, a woman's voice, low and broken, saying words I couldn't understand except for one repeated over and over. "Open." The lock on the front door clicked. I didn't think. I threw it open and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the truck, tires spitting gravel as I tore down the road. In the rear view, the house shrank to a smudge, but I swear I saw a figure on the porch, small and still, holding something that gleamed in the moonlight. I quit the firm the next day, burned the Polaroid, tried to forget. That was 3 years ago. Last week, a county clerk from Lufkin called me out of nowhere, said they were updating property records, asked if I'd been the last to inspect the Wilcox place. When I confirmed, she grew quiet and then said, almost apologetically, "We tore it down 2 months ago, but the demolition crew found something strange." "What kind of strange?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, There was a room inside with the door nailed shut. When they pried it open, the walls were covered in carvings. Hundreds of names. One of them was yours. I told her she must have read it wrong, but even now at night I can still hear the knocking. 3 paws too, from somewhere inside my apartment walls, and sometimes when I wake from the sound I smell copper and pine. In the quiet farmland east of Abilene, there's a stretch of open field where the grass never seems to grow right. Locals call it Prairie Ridge, though the ridge itself is barely a rise in the land, just enough to break the horizon when the sun sets behind it. The soil is dry, cracked, and pale like old bone, and for as long as anyone can remember, that field has stayed empty. No crops, no cattle, no life at all. But on some nights when the moon hides behind clouds and the wind dies completely, people say they hear a tractor out there, chugging slow, steady, and mechanical, like it's plowing rows in a harvest that hasn't existed since 1938. I first heard about Prairie Ridge from a man named Wayne Fuller, an older fellow who worked part-time at a feed store on the outskirts of town. He told me the story one afternoon while measuring out molasses for cattle feed. He said his father had worked that very field before the war, back when it belonged to the Callahan family. Wayne's father swore that something happened there in the summer of '38, something bad enough that the county marked the land unfit for agricultural use. They said it was poisoned by runoff, but nobody ever found where it came from. Wayne said his old man didn't believe that explanation. He said one night the tractor just kept running long after the sun went down, and by dawn the Callahans were gone. The sheriff found the tractor idling in circles, the plow sunk deep into the dirt, and no sign of the family except for their boots sitting neatly by the porch. I didn't believe it at first. I was a photographer back then, traveling through West Texas looking for abandoned places to document, churches, barns, and ghost towns. I'd heard plenty of ghost stories in small towns like Abilene. Still, there was something about the way Wayne told it, the certainty in his voice that made me curious. He drew me a rough map on a feed receipt, marking a turnoff along County Road 209. "Don't go out there after dark," he said as I folded it into my jacket pocket. "You'll hear things you ain't supposed to." I drove out the next morning, the August sun already baking the horizon. Prairie Ridge didn't look like much, just a few dozen acres of dry land surrounded by scrub oak and mesquite. A rusted barbed wire fence stretched across the property, sagging in places, and beyond it stood a collapsed barn and the remains of a white farmhouse. The roof had caved in long ago and vines crept through the empty windows like veins. The silence was strange. Even in the Texas heat, there should have been cicadas or crickets, but there was nothing. No sound except the crunch of gravel under my boots. I spent most of the morning taking photos of the house and barn. The place felt frozen in time. Inside the farmhouse, I found old tools scattered on the floor, a rocking chair tipped on its side, and a calendar still tacked to the kitchen wall, June 1938. The last date circled in red. The paper was brittle, flaking away when I touched it. When I stepped into what must have been the parlor, the floor groaned beneath my weight and a bird's nest fell from the rafters, scattering dust through a shaft of light. That's when I noticed the tracks in the dirt outside, fresh, deep tire marks cutting across the field. I walked to the edge of the porch and followed them with my eyes. They ran in long, even rows, perfect lines as if the field had just been plowed. The air felt different then, heavier. I crouched down, touched the soil, and found it cold. Not just cool, but cold enough to sting my fingers even though the sun was beating down hard. The ground smelled like oil and damp earth. I turned around, half expecting to see someone, maybe another photographer, a farmer, but there was no one. The tracks disappeared at the far edge of the field, where the land dipped toward a dried-up creek bed. I told myself it was just some local kid with a tractor messing around, but something about the precision of those rows made me uneasy. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel off Highway 36. I was reviewing my photos when I noticed something strange in one of them. In the background of a wide shot of the field, there was a faint shape, something tall and metallic like a tractor silhouette, though I hadn't seen one out there. Its headlights glowed white in the photo, twin dots cutting through the grain of the image. I zoomed in until the pixels blurred and the light seemed to pulse faintly, as if it were alive. I went back the next night. I told myself it was for the photos, but I think I wanted to prove to myself that nothing was there. The road was empty, The sky pitch black except for a few stars. When I parked by the fence line, the air was still. I turned off the engine and listened. For a while, there was nothing. Then from somewhere deep in the field, I heard it. The low hum of an engine turning over. Slow, mechanical, steady. It wasn't close, but the sound rolled across the dry grass like thunder. The ground beneath my boots seemed to vibrate with each rumble. I stepped over the fence, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the dark. The air smelled of gasoline and burnt soil. As I moved farther in, I saw the dirt ahead start to shift, small clumps rolling aside as if something heavy were moving under it. Then came the squeal of metal, the distinct clatter of a plow blade dragging through rock. The noise grew louder, closer until I could feel the rhythm of the machine in my chest. I swung my light toward the sound and saw nothing, just the field stretching endless and empty. But when I turned off my flashlight, I saw two faint lights flicker near the horizon, white and far apart like tractor lamps. They moved slowly across the field, cutting long paths of light through the dark, though there was nothing to cast them. No engine, no driver, no shape, just the lights and the sound. I watched, frozen, as the invisible machine made a wide turn, the rows of earth parting perfectly behind it, each furrow cold and damp as if freshly cut. My heart was pounding. Every instinct told me to run, but I stayed until the lights reached the far end of the field and faded into the distance. The sound of the engine idled once, then stopped completely. The silence afterward was deafening. I turned to go back to my truck, and that's when I saw the footprints. Not tire tracks, boot prints. Dozens of them trailing behind me in the soil, though I'd walked alone. They were deep, larger than mine, and they circled around me as if someone had been following in step. I bolted for the fence, scraping my arm on the wire as I climbed over, and didn't stop until I was inside the cab of my truck with the doors locked. The radio flickered on by itself, hissing with static, and underneath it I could hear the faint rhythm of that engine again, revving once, then twice, before fading into silence. I left Abilene the next morning. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that I'd delete the photos and forget the whole thing. But when I looked at the pictures again a week later, they'd changed. The daylight shots of the field were darker now, as if taken at dusk. The rows of dirt were deeper, the shadows longer, and in one photo, right near the horizon, I could see the outline of a man standing beside something tall and metallic. His head was tilted down, his hand resting on what looked like a plow handle. Wayne called me a few months later, said he'd gone out there himself after hearing what I'd seen. They found his truck parked by the fence, engine still running. The seat was empty, but the radio was on, playing an old gospel hymn through the static. The sheriff's office searched the field for 3 days but didn't find him. Just one thing out of place. The soil had been freshly turned, all in straight, perfect rows. Now sometimes when I drive through that part of Texas, I roll down the window and listen. If the night is dark enough and the air still, I can hear it faintly. The steady hum of a tractor plowing endless furrows into an empty field. And for a moment, the wind carries the smell of gasoline and cold earth, like the land itself still remembers the work it was never meant to finish. On the outskirts of San Saba, there's a dirt road that cuts through mesquite and cedar scrub, leading to what's left of the Dyer farmhouse. The boards are gray and warped, the chimney long collapsed, and the roofline sagging like an old spine. Most people pass by without stopping, but if you ask anyone who's lived there long enough, they'll tell you the same thing. The attic door still opens every year on the night the Dyer boy disappeared. Always the same hour, always the same sound. It's one of those stories that clings to a place like dust you can't sweep out. The Dyers came from Oklahoma back in the 30s, right after the Dust Bowl stripped their land bare. Thomas Dyer, his wife Eileen, and their son Caleb. They bought 50 acres cheap, settled into the old house, and tried to start again. But the land was mean, dry, stubborn, full of rattlers and roots that refused to take seed. Folks said Thomas started to change, that he'd walk the fields at night talking to himself, carrying a lantern even when the moon was full. They said the boy started drawing strange things on the barn walls, circles with crosses through them, little stickmen hanging from trees. In the summer of 1939, the boy vanished. He was 10 years old. His mother said he'd gone up to the attic to look for a kite. His father said the trap door had been shut. No one heard a scream. No one saw him again. They searched for weeks. Dogs, neighbors, even the sheriff from Brady came out with a few men to comb the woods. Nothing. Just the sound of that windmill creaking and the smell of rain that never came. By the fall, Thomas had hung himself in the barn. Eileen left 2 weeks later, walking barefoot down the road until a passing trucker picked her up. She never came back. The farm sat empty after that, but every October someone would swear they saw a light in the attic window. A single lantern glow swinging back and forth. And then, without fail, the old trapdoor would be found open the next morning. I first heard about it when I moved to San Saba for work. I was renting a little house near the river, teaching history at the high school. A few of the older kids used to dare each other to drive out there on the anniversary. One of them, a quiet kid named Wyatt, told me he'd actually gone inside. He said the door had been nailed shut when they got there, but halfway through the night they heard something upstairs, a thud like someone walking on the floorboards. When they ran out, the door was hanging open. He swore he saw a shadow move across the window, short like a child. I didn't believe him. You hear so many of those stories around here, and most of them start with beer and end with headlights bouncing down a dirt road. But something about it stuck with me. That fall I drove out myself. I don't know what I expected. Maybe to prove there was nothing there, maybe just to see the place before it rotted away completely. The air was dry that night, full of that metallic smell that comes before rain. The house was smaller than I thought, its porch sagging, the paint long stripped away. The front door was off its hinges, leaning against the wall inside. Dust and old insulation hung in the air. I could hear mice skittering somewhere behind the walls. The stairs groaned under my boots. At the top was a narrow hallway with 3 rooms, 2 bedrooms and a door in the ceiling with a rope handle hanging down. The rope was newer than the rest of the house. I could see the fray on it, clean and white, like someone had replaced it recently. I told myself it was nothing, and kids probably. Still, when I tugged on it, the trapdoor resisted like it didn't want to move. When it finally did, a gust of warm air came down, smelling of hay and something else. Something faintly sweet, like old fruit left to rot. I climbed up. The attic was small, low enough that I had to crouch. The floor was covered in dust except for one spot in the center, a clean square about 3 feet wide. In it sat a small wooden box. I wiped it off and found initials carved into the lid. CD inside were a few things, a marble, a scrap of ribbon, and a folded piece of paper. I opened it carefully. The handwriting was a child's, shaky and large. It said, "I can hear him calling. He says I can help. He says I'll see Mama again if I just open the door." I felt something shift behind me, just a soft thump, like a footstep. When I turned, nothing was there. But I swear I heard breathing, slow and steady, just above my head. The rafters creaked and the light from my lantern flickered. I started backing toward the ladder. Then I saw it, handprints in the dust around the clean spot, small ones leading away from the box toward the wall. They stopped at a section of boards darker than the rest. I don't know why, but I knocked on them. They sounded hollow. I should have left then, but curiosity is a dangerous thing. I pried one of the boards loose with the end of my flashlight. Behind it was a space about 2 feet deep. Inside, curled up like he'd just fallen asleep, was the mummified body of a child. His clothes were nothing but rags. Around his neck was a length of rope, tied loosely as if someone had been playing with it. His mouth was open, and there was something written on the inside of the wall next to him. Small, careful letters scratched into the wood. It said, "He let me in. I don't remember climbing down. I just remember the door slamming shut behind me when I hit the hallway." The rope handle yanked itself up like something on the other side had grabbed it. I ran out of that house, tripping over the front steps, tearing my sleeve on the porch post. When I looked back from the road, I saw the attic light flicker on, just once. I went to the sheriff the next morning. They went out there, brought a crew, even a state investigator. But when they searched the attic, the space behind the wall was empty. No box, no bones, just dust. The boards I'd pried loose were nailed back perfectly as if untouched. They said I was mistaken. Said maybe I'd found an old animal carcass or that kids had been in there since. I stopped arguing. But I still have that piece of paper. I didn't tell them I kept it. The handwriting doesn't fade. That was 3 years ago. I don't teach anymore. Moved to a place closer to Brady. Every October I tell myself I won't think about it, that I won't check the calendar. But I always do. Last night, right before midnight, I woke to a sound that didn't belong in my house. A soft, dragging creak from above. I got out of bed, heart hammering, and went to the hallway. The attic door was open, the rope swaying gently as if something had just climbed down. I live alone, and tonight is the anniversary of the Dyer boys' disappearance. I drove back into Lavaca County on a warm wind that smelled like wet fences and mesquite smoke, the kind of smell that crawls under your ribs and convinces you the past can still find your address. The highway out of Hallettsville rolled flat, brown pasture on both sides, and the last light went down behind a windmill that had been turning since my grandfather's day. I kept telling myself I was only here to sort a deed and fix a gate, take a few pictures for a broker, and get back to my life in Houston, where you can forget the shape of your own childhood if you keep just busy enough. Then the sign came up on the right, white letters on rusted pipe, and there it was again, as if I had never left. Hollow Point Ranch. When I was a kid, I thought the name was a joke about bullets, but I learned later it was a mapmaker's phrase stolen from the old survey. A shallow hollow that runs into a finger of higher ground. A point you could stand on and see the whole south pasture rolling all the way to the Navidad. The joke stuck anyway. Men in bars always like something you can say with a grin. The lock on the gate had been changed by my cousin, but the chain still carried the memory of a dozen hands, shiny in the spots where you grab without thinking. I let the truck idle while I worked the combination and listened to the grass sing under the tires of a cattle trailer moving somewhere far off. The house sat back under live oaks and hackberry, gray boards, a porch that had been replaced 3 times and still sagged like an old man's shoulders. A floodlight on the barn threw a cone that made moths look like snow. Somewhere in the dark, a dog barked the way they do when they smell a stranger, quick and furious and a little ashamed of the fear in it. The porch steps took my weight and the house took my breath. That closed-up mix of cedar and dust and mouse pellets, with the faint trace of coal oil that had soaked into sills generations before electricity came out this far. I stood in the doorway and waited for the quiet to settle around me like a shirt fresh from the line. You can't bring city nerves into a house like that. The walls will take them and gnaw. People in Hallettsville had already told me the story while pouring coffee I hadn't asked for. "You going to Hollow Point?" the waitress had said, waving the pot like a baton. "You watch that light down there, honey. Hunters say a lantern moves through that pasture at night, swinging low like somebody still searching for their head." The men at the counter nodded because men like having a thing to nod about. A younger one with a cap that promised parts and service leaned back and added, "Don't shoot at it. You'll feel stupid if you hit a cow." They laughed at that, and the laughter didn't travel far before it fell flat. Shiner signs buzzed in the window. Somebody coughed. I said I would keep my aim to myself and finished my eggs and drove out anyway. Because the difference between superstition and inheritance is mostly paperwork. The first night nothing moved but moths and the windmill tail. A lazy creak as the breeze turned it to face a shy wind out of the southeast. I laid on the couch the way I had when weather pinned us here as kids. The spring still remembered where my back ended and where my worry began. Through the screen I could hear coyotes singing out on the edge of the north pasture, and a whip-poor-will near the stock tank, calling his name like an accusation. A train far off put a second voice under the first, a low freight note that vibrated in the floorboards. I went to sleep before midnight and woke once to a smell that didn't belong to sleep, a metal smell like singed wick or the skin of a match just blown out. By the time I got to the door, there was only the dark, open like the mouth of a barn. Daylight took the edge off the talk from town. It always does. In daylight, the cattle trail cuts through the broomweed and yaupon exactly where it has for 100 years, and you can see how a lantern carried by a tired man might be nothing but a star tucked low in the grass. I walked fence lines with a spool of wire and found where a hog had tried his hand at carpentry. They had rooted along the watercourse like a drunk with a shovel, and I cursed them with the casual intimacy of someone who has slept within 30 yards of their business. I fixed a stretch by the east gate and picked 3 burrs out of my sock and came back past the old air motor, the kind with a name cast into the tail, and I reached up without thinking and put my palm against the ladder where I had put it as a boy. The metal was warm. If there had ever been a ghost climbing there, I could not feel his hand. I didn't see the lantern until the second night, though the smell returned first, the way a storm can be smelled before it's felt. It came in around 1 in the morning while I sat at the kitchen table with a flashlight and a cardboard box of papers, old grazing leases, a folded plat map with coffee stains like islands, a ledger in my uncle's handwriting recording calves born, Calves weaned and calves sold, with those numbers always tilting to show how hope crooked itself into the margins. I had turned the page to the spring of 1998, when the dog on the county road barked again and then fell quiet as if a hand had petted him from behind the ears to tell him it was time to behave. In the quiet that followed, I caught that single lick of metal and wick. I stood and crossed to the window over the sink, the one that looked south across the open toward the hackberry island we called the Middle Grove. At first it was only what the mind makes to justify being awake. Then it pulled itself into a workable fact. A light moved out past the Middle Grove. It was not a coyote's eyes or a truck's headlamp. It swung. It swung in the human way, a slow arc back and forth measured by a stride you could set a clock by. Only it swung low, as if the hand that held it was down near boots or knees, no higher than the belly hair of a cow. It moved 6 paces and paused. The pause was not shy. It was patient. Another 6 paces and another pause, the circle of light brushing the ground in small, careful sweeps. I know lights. I know how LED looks when it bounces off grass. This wasn't that. This had a heart to it, a small flutter at the center when the wick catches air and betrays its age. I didn't breathe until I found out what I was going to do, and I did not find that out until my hand had already touched the doorknob. Inside the porch was a flashlight with a dying battery. On the kitchen counter was a box of matches. In the pantry, because my family kept things nobody needed as proof that time was a circle and not a line, there was a lantern. I lifted it down. When I struck the match and touched it to the dry wick, the flame rose like a sentence that had been waiting. The smell came stronger, and with it came a memory I had taken care not to remember, rising not as a picture at first, but as a feeling in my shoulders, and the thick sense of having chosen once, long ago, not to say certain words at a certain moment. I told myself the only way to get through the dark was to go into it and out again. That's a lie. But at 2 a.m, it can carry you down steps you have no business walking. Outside, the moths ran to my light like children who had found their father, and for a second the porch might have been an altar. Then the grass took me. Dew soaked my jeans the way absolution might if it were cold. The night had weight and voice and a flavor like tin. I kept my lantern low because the night seemed to require it, and because anything higher felt like you were making a scene. The other light had paused again, and in my careful, clumsy way I matched its pace with my own. There is a rhythm to pastures you remember with your ankles and knees. The ground rolls and the grass hides the dips, and if you have danced it since baby teeth, you won't fall unless you deserve to. I passed the air motor, and the sound of the sucker rod inside its pipe came like a slow breath, drawing water none of us could see. A chorus of crickets, a single owl, the faint rush of traffic a mile off where 90A throws its cars through the dark. All of it lay under the other fact, the light that moved and paused and swept low, like someone who had lost something and was going to keep losing it until the end of time, unless someone said otherwise. The first time it came near enough to see shape, there was no shape. It had the size of a lantern and the behavior of a lantern and the old stubborn intent of one. No hand presented itself. No boot stood behind it. It threw its own shadow on grass, and it threw mine too, and both shadows looked empty. When I took one more step than was wise, it swung the way a person swings a lantern when his patience thins. Not fast, not angry, just definite. I stopped where I was. Somewhere behind the live oak you could hear cattle shuffling where they bedded. One coughed, and the sound had grief in it for no reason they could name. The lantern made a small tightening circle on the ground, as if it had reached a spot it had reached before. I lowered my own flame until I could feel its heat on my knuckles and waited, while the night described the space between us. I wish I could tell you I spoke first, the way men say they did when they need to recruit their own courage in the retelling. I didn't. The light moved. It swept left and right and left again, slow, and then the circle settled on something in the grass. My own circle found it too. A rusted ring sat there half buried, the kind you use to hitch a lead rope. A little island of iron in a sea of Johnson grass. I knew it the way your fingers know a scar on your own face. When we were kids, we backed horses up to that ring and tied them while we checked the stock tank, and Wade had leaned into his horse to scratch the place under the mane, and told me a story about a family that lived in a house with no doors. The memory hit so hard I could feel where the June sun had baked the top of my ears that day. Wade. We had hunted together out here the summer before the big drought, running hogs at night like fools, a lantern between us on a fence post because we thought it made us look like men who knew what they were doing. He left town after that summer, and I never saw him again is the form I had used. The neat sentence I stitched over a hole too ragged to look at. The lantern moved on, and I followed like a dog. I could have gone back to the house and shut the door, and let the story remain something that was told in diners to people with soft hands. I didn't. We crossed the low wet area before the middle grove, and the scent of the Navidad climbed up through roots and mud. I stepped on limestone as flat as coins and heard the tiny music of water under rock. The light paused again at a fence corner where an old cedar post leaned, and I saw the place where the wire had been twisted to hold a lantern handle, and the handle had been there a long time, long enough to bite into wood. Another step, and I could see the faint crescent on the post where heat had once licked and stained it. We had left the lantern there the night I cannot call anything other than the night the story began. I am not going to pretend I remember exactly what we were doing or why, beyond what boys do when the world is too big to live in, without making it small with a purpose. Hogs had torn up the lower pasture for weeks, and my uncle said if we put a bullet into one, he would put a beer into us. Every night the coyotes came to argue with the calves, and we argued back with the bravado you borrow because you think it will pay you back with interest. The moon had been thin. The lantern had been almost out of fuel, and Wade had laughed at me for not filling it. We brought it down anyway because a light on a post makes you feel like you've made camp in a life that otherwise doesn't have much of a border. We laid in the grass near that cedar post and listened to the rooting and snorting and whispered plans we were not qualified to make. I fired at a shape that might have been hog or might have been shadow, because boys want to be the one who did the thing. The shot cracked off the limestone and answered itself off the windmill. Wade cursed and stood, and his boot caught the wire, or his boot missed the wire, and his shoulder turned, or it didn't. I know the sound his body made in the grass. I know the silence after. I know the way my mouth could not invent a word that didn't taste like a lie. He got up, I told it. He was fine, I told it. He left town, I told it. He did not write me letters, I told it, because we were both too busy being men. The lantern that was not mine pushed on, a pace at a time, across the little flat between the post and the middle grove, and then it stopped and drew circles on the ground as if looking for a dropped tool. I knelt, and the grass turned cold under my knees. I lowered my own light and used my left hand to move aside the green. A quartz flake winked. A bit of rusted wire curled like a question mark. There was a small depression I had never noticed because you would only notice it if you were down on your face the way a person is, if he is helpless and angry at once. My fingers found the edge of something that wasn't rock. I scraped dirt until my nails were black. It came up slow, reluctant. A small tin with a hinged lid, the kind people once used for tobacco or matches. The lid had been scratched in a way no plow would scratch. Inside, nested in the dry like a leaf in a book, lay a circle of tin from a beer can Wade had cut with his pocket knife and bent into a tag for his dog because he couldn't afford the one from the feed store. The letters were crude but his, and something he had stamped into it with an awl caught my light. WD under that. A shallow cross like the ones on old survey stones. I don't know why he hid it. Boys hide things because one day they want to find them again and remind themselves they were once a boy. I held the tag and my hands shook. The other lantern tipped in acknowledgement, a tiny bow, and moved. We came to the edge of the middle grove, and the light turned not into the trees but along the outer circle, sweeping the drip line where roots make small humps in the dirt. It paused at 3 o'clock around the circle and made the small insistent motion of someone saying, "Here. No, here, pay attention." I went to my knees again and put my fingers down and touched something smooth, not stone. I moved dirt and it moved back, and the shape of a tooth came out of the earth, small and human. So simple a fact it weighed almost nothing in my palm. I put it on my tongue because we are still animals when we are hurt, and I knew that taste the way a man knows the taste of a name. My vision narrowed until there was only the circle of the lantern and the small white thing in my hand, and the dark ring of the world pressing in to listen. "I'm sorry," I said. The words fell out without ceremony, 27 years late, powder dry and so heavy I felt the ground accept them with relief. "I am sorry for the shot and the silence. I am sorry I called your mother and lied. I am sorry for the night I drove out and sat here and did not dig. I am sorry for how much of what I became was ordered around not having to look for you." The lantern did not back away or come closer. It burned. It burned the way a conscience burns that first clear minute, when you hold it to the thing you avoided and stop pretending it is a stranger. When I set the tooth down on the rusted ring by the hitch and turned to go, the light slid sideways and blocked me with nothing but intention. It made another small circle. It was not done. We dug together. I used my hands because there was something obscene about a shovel in that place. The dirt had the resistance of memory and the courtesy of a confession made too late. A button surfaced, then a scrap of fabric that no longer remembered its color. A length of torn nylon cord. At dawn I had a small stack of objects that did not add up to a body, but made a case no court would need to deliberate. The lantern kept burning after sunrise, pale now, the way a candle looks foolish in a lit room, but stubborn, still sweeping low, patient as an old man in a field, and then it turned as if to say follow and slid toward the fence and the shallow cut below the stock tank. There the ground was softer and my hands went deeper. And when they touched the smooth curve of bone, they did not recoil because I had been touching it all along in the dark pieces of my day and did not know its name. I covered it again, shaking as if the earth had grown cold. The lantern made a last pass over the ground and went dim until it was nothing at all and the morning birds knitted the edges of the world back together, with thread made of noise and sunlight. I called the sheriff when town was awake enough to put a man behind a desk. I told him my name and the name of the land and the year that was stuck like a thorn in me, and he came with a deputy and a young woman from the state who looked like she had been raised to keep a kind face in bad places. They brought the kind of measured attention government carries to ground that keeps its own counsel. We walked out to the middle grove and I pointed and felt the heat of shame run up my neck and sit behind my ears. The woman didn't ask much. She watched the dirt like it could speak. When they pulled the bone from the cut by the tank, the sheriff didn't look at me. And when they put it in a bag, he still didn't look. And when he finally did, it was the way a man looks at a boy he has known a long time and suddenly sees as someone else. He could have asked me why I never said anything. He could have told me what to do next. Instead, he told me to drink some water, and for that I liked him and hated him in equal portions. The woman wrote things down and her pencil made a dry sound I will hear in any pencil forever. The story went how stories go in places that would rather not be surprised. Quietly and in the mouths of people who have been saving sentences for years. The waitress put down a cup of coffee she didn't charge me for and said her brother had always said Wade wouldn't have left without his dog. The man in the parts hat said he had a cousin who found a lantern in the ditch once and it scared him so bad he put it back and apologized out loud to no one. The sheriff called me in and asked me to tell him everything I had told the land, and I did. And he wrote less of it than would make a man feel proofed by the telling. I drove out to Yoakum to find a woman who used to be Wade's mother, but had learned to hold that word without hurting herself. She sat at a kitchen table under a calendar with bluebonnets on it and listened to the part that mattered, and then she put her hand over mine and said she knew boys and she knew land and she knew how the two can make a third thing you cannot name in polite company. Her eyes were wet and they didn't blame, and that was unbearable. I told her where the grove was and she said she would go when the time was right, and I said, there is no right time for this. And we both understood I meant there is also no wrong time, and that left us in a small human place, where words are blunt and mercy is a chair you pull out and offer, because what else can you do? I slept in the house again that night because leaving would have made what had happened feel like a fever dream, and I needed it to be a fact that could follow me around. I left the lantern on the porch because part of me wanted whatever moved out there to know I had nothing to hide anymore. When the dog on the county road barked, he barked differently. It was a greeting bark, the familiar rise and fall of a life in which nothing astonishing is happening. Around midnight, I smelled the coal oil smell again in the kitchen, and I went to the window, and there it was, out past the middle grove, still moving, still sweeping low, the same patient intention in its motion. For a second, anger rose in me, bright as a match head. I had given up my secret. I had dug with my hands until they ached. I had put the tooth on my tongue and told a mother the sentence she had already learned by another route. The light was supposed to be done. It wasn't. It tracked the ground the way fever tracks a brow. It reached the cedar post. It paused. It made a circle. It turned toward the house and came straight. There was a moment at the porch rail when it hesitated, and if you have never watched a thing that is not a person appear to swallow its pride before doing the human thing, you have missed a kind of humility that can break your chest from the inside. The lantern lifted. It lifted to the height of a heart, and then to the height of a face, and then beyond, to where a man's head would have been if he had one, and for a breath the light shined, not on boards or grass, but on the air, where I would have expected features and there were none. I could feel the heat on my chin and throat. It tilted in a way that asked a question without words. If you have ever stood before a mirror and not seen what you needed because you had not told the truth to yourself in a long time, you know the shape of that question. I lifted my hand without knowing it and touched the place on my neck where boys carry the shadow of the men they become. I said I was sorry again, and this time I said it to the part of me that had kept its mouth shut. The light dropped, not in anger, but with the gentle finality of a hand that sets down a tool it will no longer need. It turned, went down the steps, crossed the yard, and picked its slow way across the pasture toward the middle grove, swinging low again, always low, like someone still searching for his head or maybe for the reason he lost it. The next morning, the state woman left with her bags labeled in a neat hand. The sheriff touched the brim of a hat that had seen both weddings and graves. I walked the fence to the south all the way to where the land falls off, and you can see the river flash when the sun is easy and the wind is lazy. I tried to understand why the lantern hadn't stopped. 27 years is a long time for a light to be carried by anything that isn't fueled by guilt. I tried on the notion that it wasn't only Wade who needed finding. There are pieces of yourself you leave in fields because you think you will not be coming back. Then you come back and you can feel them like a draft under a door. I went to the cedar post by daylight and put my hand where heat had marked it, and knew I could sand that mark and paint over it, and the paint would peel in a year because some stains are not in wood. They are in whatever watches you when you sleep, making sure you don't get away without paying the balance. I stayed one more night because I wanted an answer from a thing that has no mouth. It came and gave me none. Only that slow, stubborn attention to the ground, as if the earth kept giving up small truths and the light was determined to gather them until it could make a head from the pieces. I sat on the porch with my lantern on the step and understood finally that I didn't need the light to stop to start living a different life. I needed to carry the same patience the light had, the willingness to sweep low and look under the grass every night until I could say to myself, without flinching, exactly who had fired and who had lied, and who had been brave and who had been a boy. I fell asleep in the swing and woke to the sound of the windmill pulling water we would both drink. The dog on the county road barked and then settled. Morning came with no miracle, only the suspicion that I had seen one and it had turned into air before I could name it. When I left Hollow Point later that week, I locked the gate with hands that didn't quite look like mine anymore. In town, men nodded at me the way men do when they have put you into the right slot on the board. The waitress touched my wrist and said I looked better, which was an indecent kindness. I told her the fence was fixed and the broker would call her cousin if he still wanted to graze. And she poured me coffee the color hope turns when you stir it with yesterday's spoon. The rumor would travel without me, lane to lane and porch to porch, and grow corn silk and feathers before it came back home again. On nights when the wind drops and the hogs root close, hunters will look up and see a light down low in the pasture, swinging slow, stubborn as a man who refuses to miss what he came to find. They will point and tell the person next to them about the headless searcher at Hollow Point, and their voices will carry into the grass, and the grass will keep the secret it was given. They won't know the smell that comes before the light. They won't know the heat against the throat. They won't know how the lantern lifts sometimes like a question, and then goes on sweeping the ground because the question was not answered, and maybe will not be. They will raise their rifles and then think better of it, because even men who want to laugh have the sense to bow sometimes. And if they stand very still and listen hard, they might hear among the crickets and the creak of the armator a person who has learned how to say one sentence right finally, the only sentence he ever needed, repeating it into the grass so it will have time to root. I am sorry. I am sorry. I am sorry. The light will keep moving whether he says it or not. The pasture will be wide enough for both of them. And somewhere just beyond the middle grove, under the specific tree where you can see the river shine at noon if the breeze lays down, the ground will take another small breath and then be quiet. And the lantern will make one more careful circle and then another. And a man leaving through a gate will feel as if a hand has touched the place on his neck, where a blade of grass sometimes clings when you have been lying face down in it long enough to learn your own weight. I signed for the Merrill place on a Tuesday with the kind of pen that scratches, the metal tip catching little burrs in the realtor's carbon copy, as if even the ink was reluctant to take root here. The woman at the title office in Woodville made a joke about me being brave, then didn't give me my hand back right away. She kept squeezing, looking past me toward the glass where the dogwood blossoms threw off a glare like pale fires, and the courthouse clock ticked as loud as a heartbeat. I told her I wasn't a believer in stories. I told her I needed quiet and cheap and a piece of Tyler County as far from my old life as you could get, and still have a mailbox. She let my hand go and said there were better ways to get quiet than buying that house. She said, people go missing from quiet all the time. The place sat past Colmasneil, and a mile shy of where the pines thicken into the old big thicket, off a county road that pretended to be pavement until it remembered what it was and turned to red grit. The mailbox had Merrill hand-painted on it in a script you'd expect on a recipe card. Someone had lined the ditch with beer bottles half sunk in clay. I rolled the truck window down and the smell came in, sour and green and resinous, a humid breath off the forest. The house looked like most old Texas farmhouses do from the road, 2 stories and a wrap porch that sagged on its nails, paint bleached to chalk, a chimney tilting just enough to feel like it was studying you. I parked under the hackberries and the cicadas rattled themselves into a fever. There was a barn beyond the house that leaned against its own shadow. Nothing moved except a red-tailed hawk circling somewhere above the tree line and a frayed rope swing under a dying oak that turned once with an old man's patience. Inside, the air was cooler than it had any right to be, damp and a little sweet, like a thrift store aisle that never quite dries out after a flood. The floral wallpaper, yellow with age, caught my fingers when I brushed it. There were places where it had blistered, places where the pattern buckled over nail heads and the indentations showed like fingerprints pressing from the other side. The house had that underfoot language all old houses have, a groan in one stair and a complaint in the right side of the front room when you put your full weight down. But there was something else too, a paper rasp that whispered from the walls when I passed. I told myself mice. I told myself glue unsticking, air pockets breathing. I told myself all kinds of reasonable things. I unpacked in the way a person does when he doesn't expect it to last. A mattress on the floor upstairs, a cooler in the kitchen, a single lamp. The first night I left the windows open and listened to the whip poor will at the tree line and the far hiss of traffic from 69. Later the highway would be a boundary I respected, but that night it felt like a lifeline. When I woke near midnight, it was to the smell of old paste and something else below it, sharp and a little metallic like photographs drying in a darkroom. A sound like paper peeling came from the hallway. I sat up and the lamp popped, the bulb flaring and dying with a little puff of gray smoke that hung in the room long after it should have thinned. It was only a foot of peeled wallpaper, no bigger than a placemat, but underneath were photographs tacked directly to the boards, overlapping like shingles. The one on top of the little revealed field was a woman in her 40s on a hot day somewhere. You can tell heat in a picture by the way the light chews everything to the same pale color, and people hold their mouths. She stood by a gas pump with a hand raised like she was about to wave at whoever was taking the photo, except her eyes weren't on the lens. They were tilted a measure to the right, fixed on something else. You could see a sliver of the something in the shadow line of the next pump, but the picture cut off just before it showed you anything you could name. I was not thinking ghosts. I was thinking family quirks and bad taste in decor, and the way people get attached to their own histories out here where the forest keeps most records, and what the courthouse misses, the creek takes. The next day, with the sun beating through the blinds and the pine needles outside glittering like they'd been greased, I found a cabinet in the pantry that opened from the wrong side. Inside were mason jars full of dark liquid labeled in pencil with months and years, and a cardboard box of old photo corners and little brass tacks. The jars had a skin on them that quivered when I breathed on it. Fixer, I thought, stop bath. My mind knew those words because I'd run a school newspaper darkroom in Lufkin in the 90s before everything turned into pixels. The smell that had threaded the house since I walked in made a kind of sense then. The Merrills had been developing photographs in their kitchen. That was a weird hobby for a farm family. Before I remembered, everybody in Tyler County had a cousin with a hobby that would make you blink twice. Still, it itched at something under the surface. People don't wallpaper over their own art. I peeled a little more in the dining room to see if there were more. There were hundreds. Men in church clothes outside tiny frame sanctuaries with hand-painted signs. Boys at the B.A. Steinhagen boat ramp with fish held out like offerings. A woman standing in front of the Tyler County booster rack on the courthouse square, the headline visible but become so trivial next to her face that my eyes ignored it. Every face pointed almost at the camera, yet not quite. The photos were mounted edge to edge, then wallpapered over, then mounted again layer on layer, a palimpsest of strangers. No names were written on the backs of the few I carefully pried up at the corners. No dates I could find. I thought it was a memorial board like you see in East Texas churches. Those bulletin boards with curling snapshots and scotch tape and thumbtacks, people lost to moving away or dying off. Marked at least in communion, bread, and memories. But I kept thinking about the way those eyes dropped to one side. Identical in their distraction. The more I looked, the more it felt like the photographs. Agreed on something I was not allowed to see. I drove into Woodville to buy more bulbs and a proper tool for prying tacks, and to sit at the counter at the cafe and hear the story the way people tell it, when they think you're not going to leave. It came out in pieces. The Merrills had been plain people. Clyde worked for the county survey office and later for the pipeline, measuring lines in the heat and writing numbers that turned into decisions far away. Callie taught at the school in Spurger. Two kids who did a year of 4-H and then disappeared in 1948 like fog lifting. No one could say more than that without their voices getting narrow and drying up. When I said I'd found photographs under the wallpaper, faces I didn't recognize, a man with bar oil on his hands and a Timberline hat said a lot of folks didn't recognize faces they should have if you follow him. He said, some people get pulled sideways of their lives and don't know it until they try to go back and there isn't anything there. That night, the sound started again, a whispery pealing that worked from one corner to the other like a slow mouth. I put the new bulb in the lamp, expecting the same dramatic failure, but it held. The light lay over the wall and turned the flowered pattern into 1,000 little eyes. The new peel was in the hallway this time, high up where the flashing had left a raised seam. I stood on a chair and eased the corner down, and there I was, grainy but unmistakable, passing in front of the window by the stairs with a roll of paper towels and a hammer in one hand. The angle was from above and to the right. I had no idea how that angle was possible. I swallowed and felt the taste of old chemicals on the back of my tongue. The second photo below it was me again, asleep on the floor mattress. The third was me standing in the kitchen holding one of the jars up to the light. There were others, hundreds deep. I lowered myself off the chair with a knee that didn't bend right and sat on the bottom step while the house breathed through the cracks. I tried to go back to reason then. Someone had been living here without the realtor knowing it. Someone had cameras in the walls. I walked the house with the kind of focus that has you hearing your own blood. I checked every outlet, every corner where a pinhole could lurk. I took the faceplates off light switches. I pulled the back off the bathroom cabinet and found only a silt of old dead wasps and one brittle blue marble that rolled toward me and stopped before it should have, as if the floor slanted toward me. When I returned to the hallway, the top photograph had gone damp, beads forming on its surface like sweat. I watched them gather and run and leave no smear, the emulsion taking in the wet as if that were what it needed to finish itself. I tried to leave then. It would be more accurate to say I drove in circles while the pines grew taller and the sky got lower until I hit 69 at an angle that made no sense, and then, without really deciding to, I turned back down the county road because the truck felt like walking in shoes a size too small. The house received me without expression. The smell was stronger. The sweetness turned heavy, cloying, that darkroom trace becoming the whole note. I opened every window and the wind that came through wasn't the wind outside. It felt cool the way old cedar closets do. The blinds shifted as if someone had just walked by and brushed them. I called the sheriff. A deputy named Runnels came out in a tan uniform gone shiny at the elbows. He kept his hand near his belt like a man who knows his gun is mostly ceremonial. He stood in the hallway and squinted at my photograph and then the ones beneath it. He pulled one free, a boy sitting on the hood of a white Ford with a dog leaning against his jeans. Runnels turned it over, found nothing and put it back exactly where it had been, pressing the edges down with his thumbs in a gesture that made me think of closing a wound. He said an investigator out of Beaumont could come tomorrow and I was not to pull one more piece of paper up. He said he'd sit a few hours out front just to keep me company, make sure nobody came around that shouldn't. He went down the steps, and the rope swing turned as he passed without wind to justify it. I watched his cruiser lights cycle red against the trees as dust came up from the ground and ate the road. The house settled into a stillness that felt watched. I tried the television I'd dragged in and found nothing but snow, the old kind that used to mean the world was bigger than broadcasts. The lamp kept its light. I was reading a Tyler County booster from last week, an article about a fundraiser at Dam B, when the living room wall issued a sound like knuckles cracking. A section of wallpaper the size of a dinner plate lifted all at once and fell to the floor, curling. Underneath was the deputy, his face near and wide, the cruiser light a smear of red at the edge of the frame. His eyes were not on the lens. They were looking past it, right at the front door. The second picture below was the empty road with twin shadows cast from a light source I couldn't place. The third was the rope swing turning. There was no picture of him driving away. I went to the porch and the yard laid itself out under the moon like a photograph, perfect and flat, and the outline of the cruiser's tires in the dust were covered with a lacquer of dew, as if they had always been there. The phone wouldn't dial out after that. When I lifted the receiver, I got a thin hiss that had syllables in it if you listened too hard. The photographs warmed under my hand like living skin. I slept in starts, each time waking to that gentle peel and the tender smack of paper laying itself back down. I dreamed of a room with no windows, only wallpaper from floor to ceiling and the pattern repeating until it made me ill, and every blossom in the pattern had a face in the center instead of petals, and each little face was turned just to the right. In the morning, I drove as far as Town Bluff and stood by the spillway and let the noise of water scrub my head. I bought tape, tacks, rolls of contractor plastic, and a case of cheap flour paste. I came back and I covered the photographs as if that would cover the problem. I laid plastic over them like a shroud and pasted the wallpaper back as tight as I could. The house quieted. The sweetness retreated to an aftertaste. The air lost its cool. Birds came into the yard and paced, the first I had seen. And one small brave cardinal hopped up onto the porch rail and scolded the world until it realized it was alone. For 2 days, nothing peeled. I walked around with the strange pride of a man who has convinced himself he has solved something eternal with his hands and $10 worth of supplies. On the third night, I woke to a new smell. Not chemicals now, but old water, cellar water. I went downstairs and found the wallpaper bubbled like a blister. The paste had turned to a gray slurry that ran down the wall in patient fat tears. The photographs beneath had buckled and relaxed like breathing. When I touched the wall, it was cold enough to hurt. I stopped keeping count of the layers. I know I peeled a hallway until the board showed. Like ribs, and the photographs mounted there went back to men in hats who left their trucks at the edge of fields and women whose dresses were sewn at home and children holding spotted dogs. I know if you dug deeper, the scratches in the wood beneath the oldest pictures were not random. They were numbers and letters in a surveyor's hand that matched the angle of creek lines on maps. Locations turned to marks, and in one place, Clyde Merrill's name scribed in the same neat block as if a man's work could defend his home against what his home had become. In the kitchen, I found a photograph that had to be Callie, the schoolteacher, turned 3/4 and looking at something just off the corner of the stove where the wallpaper seam did not match the pattern. There was a knife on the counter in that picture, and a child's hand gripping the edge of the table, only the fingers visible. When I looked to that corner of my kitchen, the seam vibrated like a fly's wing. I wanted to staple it to the wall. I wanted to open it like a mouth and reach inside. Then I made the mistake that felt like a solution. I thought, if the house is a camera, I will blind it. I covered every window with tinfoil and plywood, every vent, every keyhole, the chimney throat, the gap under the door. I turned the whole place into a dark room and waited for the photographs to stop forming. They did not stop. They came faster. They were clear and close, and in some of them I was turned a little to the right, just like all the others, finally meeting what everyone else had been looking at all along. The next morning, there were boot prints on the porch that did not match mine and did not begin anywhere. They were heavy enough to dent the old pine boards and light enough that when I dusted with flour like some amateur deputy, they didn't hold a pattern except where the heel struck. The impressions were slick with a residue that smelled like developer and pond water. The house learned the shape of me. I could feel it, the way a field learns the feet that walk it. If I stood too long in one place, the wallpaper rose and dipped there like something beneath it wanted to turn and see. Sometimes I caught movement in the photographs the way you catch movement in a mirror when you're tired. The mouths on those dozens of faces were not static if I refused to stare. They made tiny movements that were too controlled to be called twitching. I took to speaking aloud, telling the house what I was doing the way Nurse Frank had told my father to speak to my mother after the stroke, so her brain could catch up to the idea of movement. It made a difference for an afternoon. Then the difference wore off like a pill. I stood at the courthouse on a Saturday with a plastic sleeve of a dozen photographs I'd taken off the wall that morning. Sensation be damned, and I asked people if they recognized anyone. Two were recognized and then unrecognized. The tentative light in the eyes of a woman with a basket who said that might be her cousin from Jasper dimming when she realized no. His ears had been different, or the stretch of his mouth. A man in boots and a church shirt said that boy looked like someone he used to fish with, and he said the name and then took it back. Backed off the name like it was a hot stove. I took the photos to the sheriff and he wasn't in and wouldn't take my call. And when I went home and pulled 2 more layers off the living room wall in rage that felt like trying to dig my way out of a barrel, I found the same 12 photographs back on the boards under the wallpaper exactly where they had been. And a 13th I didn't have. Someone standing on the courthouse steps with a plastic sleeve and a look on his face. That was the face of a man beginning to know. I tried to go back to reason then. Someone had been living here without the realtor knowing it. Someone had cameras in the walls. I walked the house with the kind of focus that has you hearing your own blood. I checked every outlet, every corner where a pinhole could lurk. I took the faceplates off light switches. I pulled the back off the bathroom cabinet and found only a silt of old dead wasps and one brittle blue marble that rolled toward me and stopped before it should have, as if the floor slanted toward me. When I returned to the hallway, the top photograph had gone damp, beads forming on its surface like sweat. I watched them gather and run and leave no smear, the emulsion taking in the wet as if that were what it needed to finish itself. I tried to leave then. It would be more accurate to say I drove in circles while the pines grew taller and the sky got lower until I hit 69 at an angle that made no sense, and then, without really deciding to, I turned back down the county road because the truck felt like walking in shoes a size too small. The house received me without expression. The smell was stronger. The sweetness turned heavy, cloying, that darkroom trace becoming the whole note. I opened every window and the wind that came through wasn't the wind outside. It felt cool the way old cedar closets do. The blinds shifted as if someone had just walked by and brushed them. I called the sheriff. A deputy named Runnels came out in a tan uniform gone shiny at the elbows. He kept his hand near his belt like a man who knows his gun is mostly ceremonial. He stood in the hallway and squinted at my photograph and then the ones beneath it. He pulled one free, a boy sitting on the hood of a white Ford with a dog leaning against his jeans. Runnels turned it over, found nothing and put it back exactly where it had been, pressing the edges down with his thumbs in a gesture that made me think of closing a wound. He said an investigator out of Beaumont could come tomorrow and I was not to pull one more piece of paper up. He said he'd sit a few hours out front just to keep me company, make sure nobody came around that shouldn't. He went down the steps, and the rope swing turned as he passed without wind to justify it. I watched his cruiser lights cycle red against the trees as dust came up from the ground and ate the road. The house settled into a stillness that felt watched. I tried the television I'd dragged in and found nothing but snow, the old kind that used to mean the world was bigger than broadcasts. The lamp kept its light. I was reading a Tyler County booster from last week, an article about a fundraiser at Dam B, when the living room wall issued a sound like knuckles cracking. A section of wallpaper the size of a dinner plate lifted all at once and fell to the floor, curling. Underneath was the deputy, his face near and wide, the cruiser light a smear of red at the edge of the frame. His eyes were not on the lens. They were looking past it, right at the front door. The second picture below was the empty road with twin shadows cast from a light source I couldn't place. The third was the rope swing turning. There was no picture of him driving away. I went to the porch and the yard laid itself out under the moon like a photograph, perfect and flat, and the outline of the cruiser's tires in the dust were covered with a lacquer of dew, as if they had always been there. The phone wouldn't dial out after that. When I lifted the receiver, I got a thin hiss that had syllables in it if you listened too hard. The photographs warmed under my hand like living skin. I slept in starts, each time waking to that gentle peel and the tender smack of paper laying itself back down. I dreamed of a room with no windows, only wallpaper from floor to ceiling and the pattern repeating until it made me ill, and every blossom in the pattern had a face in the center instead of petals, and each little face was turned just to the right. In the morning, I drove as far as Town Bluff and stood by the spillway and let the noise of water scrub my head. I bought tape, tacks, rolls of contractor plastic, and a case of cheap flour paste. I came back and I covered the photographs as if that would cover the problem. I laid plastic over them like a shroud and pasted the wallpaper back as tight as I could. The house quieted. The sweetness retreated to an aftertaste. The air lost its cool. Birds came into the yard and paced, the first I had seen, and one small brave cardinal hopped up onto the porch rail and scolded the world until it realized it was alone. For 2 days, nothing peeled. I walked around with the strange pride of a man who has convinced himself he has solved something eternal with his hands and $10 worth of supplies. On the third night, I woke to a new smell. Not chemicals now, but old water, cellar water. I went downstairs and found the wallpaper bubbled like a blister. The paste had turned to a gray slurry that ran down the wall in patient fat tears. The photographs beneath had buckled and relaxed like breathing. When I touched the wall, it was cold enough to hurt. I stopped keeping count of the layers. I know I peeled a hallway until the board showed. Like ribs, and the photographs mounted there went back to men in hats who left their trucks at the edge of fields, and women whose dresses were sewn at home, and children holding spotted dogs. I know if you dug deeper, the scratches in the wood beneath the oldest pictures were not random. They were numbers and letters in a surveyor's hand that matched the angle of creek lines on maps. Locations turned to marks, and in one place, Clyde Merrill's name scribed in the same neat block as if a man's work could defend his home against what his home had become. In the kitchen, I found a photograph that had to be Callie, the schoolteacher, turned 3/4 and looking at something just off the corner of the stove where the wallpaper seam did not match the pattern. There was a knife on the counter in that picture, and a child's hand gripping the edge of the table, only the fingers visible. When I looked to that corner of my kitchen, the seam vibrated like a fly's wing. I wanted to staple it to the wall. I wanted to open it like a mouth and reach inside. Then I made the mistake that felt like a solution. I thought, if the house is a camera, I will blind it. I covered every window with tinfoil and plywood, every vent, every keyhole, the chimney throat, the gap under the door. I turned the whole place into a dark room and waited for the photographs to stop forming. They did not stop. They came faster. They were clear and close, and in some of them I was turned a little to the right, just like all the others, finally meeting what everyone else had been looking at all along. The next morning, there were boot prints on the porch that did not match mine and did not begin anywhere. They were heavy enough to dent the old pine boards and light enough that when I dusted with flour like some amateur deputy, they didn't hold a pattern except where the heel struck. The impressions were slick with a residue that smelled like developer and pond water. The house learned the shape of me. I could feel it, the way a field learns the feet that walk it. If I stood too long in one place, the wallpaper rose and dipped there like something beneath it wanted to turn and see. Sometimes I caught movement in the photographs the way you catch movement in a mirror when you're tired. The mouths on those dozens of faces were not static if I refused to stare. They made tiny movements that were too controlled to be called twitching. I took to speaking aloud, telling the house what I was doing the way Nurse Frank had told my father to speak to my mother after the stroke, so her brain could catch up to the idea of movement. It made a difference for an afternoon. Then the difference wore off like a pill. I stood at the courthouse on a Saturday with a plastic sleeve of a dozen photographs I'd taken off the wall that morning. Sensation be damned, and I asked people if they recognized anyone. 2 were recognized and then unrecognized. The tentative light in the eyes of a woman with a basket who said that might be her cousin from Jasper dimming when she realized no. His ears had been different, or the stretch of his mouth. A man in boots and a church shirt said that boy looked like someone he used to fish with, and he said the name and then took it back. Backed off the name like it was a hot stove. I took the photos to the sheriff and he wasn't in and wouldn't take my call. And when I went home and pulled 2 more layers off the living room wall in rage that felt like trying to dig my way out of a barrel, I found the same 12 photographs back on the boards under the wallpaper exactly where they had been. And a 13th I didn't have. Someone standing on the courthouse steps with a plastic sleeve and a look on his face that was the face of a man beginning to know.